Instead of answering ancient sage Yanqing's question, Zhang Xian turned to Shui Yan and shattered his hopes. You won't be able to do it. If you try to do the same, you'll be struck to death on the spot. Why can't I do it? Shui Yan frowned in indignance. It's not just you. Even I would be unable to emulate what Kong Shiyao has just done. Zhang Xian replied. Kong Shiyao possesses Kong Shi's bloodline, and she grew up in the Kungsa domain. After the cultivation ordeal she has been through, it's no exaggeration to say that a part of the Kungsa domain exists within her. The crowd pondered for a moment before nodding. It was mentioned earlier that after Kong Shiyao's 3 ancient sage ordeals, her body was already suffused with the energies from the cultivation ordeals. If she attempted a 4th breakthrough in the Kungsa domain, it was likely that she would have been assimilated by the energies building up within her. And the very existence of the Kungsa domain is something that is not permissible by the heavens of the master-teacher continent. Zhang Xian continued. If she had attempted to resist the cultivation ordeal, she would have incurred the wrath of the heavens, and that would have only placed her in a worse position. The more she struggled, the worse the position she would have found herself in. There's no denying that the heavens wanted to punish Kong Shiyao for attempting a breakthrough. But more than that, they were more desperate to destroy the trace of the Kungsa domain that exists within her. Trying to push off the cultivation ordeal would be equivalent to hindering the heavens' enforcement of the natural laws, and that would have placed her in a worse position. The heavens would surely have struck her again and again until she was finally destroyed. However, by opening her acupoints and allowing the lightning bolts and heavenly flames in instead, it's equivalent to allowing the enforcers in to do what they needed to do. This has reduced her sins significantly, thus reducing the heavenly retribution falling upon her. On top of that, she can make use of this opportunity to clear away the energies accumulated within her body, thus killing 2 birds with 1 stone. Everyone's teeth clattered in shock. From how the heavens of the master-teacher continent were so determined to destroy the Kungsa domain, it was apparent that the 2 of them were at odds with one another. Yet, Zhang Xian was able to sharply discern this and use it to his advantage, thus wearing the heavenly retribution down through such a method. This was an extremely risky gamble. If anything had gone wrong, everything would have swiftly descended into a tragedy. While ancient sage Yanqing was amazed by the feat, he could not help but harbor some reservations toward this risky plan. In a sense, this is similar to countering poison with poison. But if the 2 energies weren't enough to nullify one another, wouldn't Shiyao be placed in a terrible position? It was one of those things that were simple in theory, but hard to execute. There was a fixed amount of accumulated energies within Kong Shiyao's body. If she had absorbed too little of the heavenly retribution, she would not be able to clear the energies away entirely. But if she absorbed too much, it could lead to her death. That's why I told her to feel with her heart, didn't I? Zhang Xian said. As Kong Shi's descendant, the number 1 genius of the Kungsa domain, if she isn't even capable of carrying out such basic estimations and controlling how much of the heavenly retribution she has taken in, I will really have nothing to say. If that's all she has, even if she survives this ordeal, I must say that she won't be able to go too far in the future. It was not out of boredom that Zhang Xian had spun up an old wives' tale to deceive Kong Shiyao. If he had revealed the truth to her at the start, her mind would have been preoccupied with other things, and that might have caused her to lose focus on her own body. That would have led to an adverse effect instead. Coming to understand the entire situation, the crowd could not help but direct impressed looks at the young man. His grasp over states of mind, the nature of the heavenly tribulation, and the capabilities of those involved. Everything was in his field of calculation, and he had managed to pull it off impeccably. As expected of a celestial master-teacher, his abilities far surpassed even those of the ancient sages. While everyone else was awestruck after hearing the young man's explanation, up in the sky, Kong Shiyao, who had experienced everything firsthand, was fully convinced of the young man's capabilities. Even though this celestial master-teacher seemed to be even younger than her, there was no doubt that he was the real deal. Even though she had not heard the explanation, she already vaguely understood the intentions behind the young man's actions. As the lightning bolts and heavenly flames from the ancient sage ordeal washed through her body, all of the energies that she had built up back in the Wuxia domain were slowly being neutralized and destroyed. Even though two forces were colliding with one another within her body remained perfectly fine. Not only so, through examining the powers within her body, she was able to further deepen her understanding of the world. Time slowly ticked by, and soon enough, the energies from the past ancient sage ordeals accumulated within her body had finally been eradicated. Kang Shiyao knew that this was the moment for her to stop, so she decisively sealed all of her acupoints and ignited her bloodline. Dissipate, she commanded. Word of law. At that moment, the ancient sage ordeal that she had summoned weakened significantly, such that it was no longer a match for her. At her command, an entire half of the ominous clouds in the sky dissipated, and the rest were gradually following suit. Hung long, with the departure of the ominous clouds, the young lady released all of her suppressed powers. She crushed all of the bottlenecks in her cultivation and reached ancient sage in a breath. Furthermore, due to the deep accumulation of her cultivation, she did not stop right after her breakthrough. Instead, her cultivation continued charging forth. Bloodline Continuance Realm Primary Stage. Bloodline Continuance Realm Intermediate Stage. In a few moments, she had already reached Ancient Sage 1 Dan Bloodline Continuance Realm Consummation, and after which, Great Philosopher Realm Primary Stage, Great Philosopher Realm Intermediate Stage, Great Philosopher Realm Consummation. In less than a minute, her cultivation soared to Great Philosopher Realm Consummation Stage, before gradually receding. Incredible! Ancient Sage Yanqing muttered in admiration. For most of their breakthroughs to Ancient Sage, they would usually stop right at Bloodline Continuance Primary Stage. Even the most talented of them all only managed to push up to Intermediate Stage, before losing the drive. However, Kang Shiyao had actually leaped 2 realms up in a single breath, reaching Great Philosopher Realm Consummation. Such a feat had never been achieved in the past tens of thousands of years, in the Wuxia domain. It's all due to this young man that Shiyao was able to make such a huge leap in her cultivation. Ancient Sage Yanqing thought in wonderment, as he turned to look at Zhang Xian. But at that moment, Zhang Xian was looking at the young lady in the sky with a dissatisfied look on his face. Continue to push on. With your accumulation, you should be able to push for a breakthrough to the Blood Reincarnation Realm. Blood Reincarnation Realm? Kang Shiyao was stunned. She quickly shook her head and replied, I have already reached my limits. I don't have enough energy in me to push for another breakthrough anymore. Even though she had made great accumulation by suppressing her cultivation through 4 ancient sage ordeals, she knew that she had already struck her limit by pushing to Ancient Sage 2 Dan Consummation in a single sitting. She did not think that she would be able to push any further than that. Limits. Those are mental constructs that you impose on yourself, Zhang Xian remarked as he flicked a droplet of blood toward Kang Shiyao. Swallow it. Yes. By that point, Kang Shiyao was completely trusting of Zhang Xian. Without any hesitation, she swallowed the droplet of blood. As soon as the droplet of blood slid down her throat, she immediately felt a burning heat inside of her threatening to combust her from the inside. Is this the blood of the deity? Kang Shiyao widened her eyes. She had absorbed quite a few blood essences of Blood Reincarnation Realm cultivators over the years, and it was for that reason that she was able to make such incredible accomplishments despite your young age. However, the blood essence that the young man had just given her was much more potent than anything she had swallowed before. In terms of power, it was at least 10 times greater than the Blood Reincarnation Realm blood essences that she had swallowed. There was only one possibility for this. It was the blood of a Dimension Shatterer Realm cultivator. To think that the young man would willingly give something so invaluable to her. Kang Shiyao's face reddened in a mixture of agitation and gratitude, but she knew that this was not the time for her thoughts to be wondering. She quickly drove her Jinqi to assimilate the energy from the blood essence. An hour later, she shattered her bottleneck once more and successfully advanced to the Blood Reincarnation Realm. Her cultivation eventually came to a halt at the intermediate stage. Feeling the energy pulsating through her body, Kong Shiyao swiftly flew over to Zhang Xian and kneeled down before him. Teacher. This time, her feelings of gratitude and respect were truly earnest. Wang. Zhang Xian's head jolted as a golden page appeared in the Library of Heaven's Path. The main reason Zhang Xian wanted to accept Kong Shiyao as his direct disciple was to form the golden page, and his goal had finally been achieved. Get up! Zhang Xian heaved a sigh of relief as he helped the young lady up. With this, he should be able to resolve the crisis surrounding the Wuxia domain. Teacher, is that our little junior? Zhang Xian turned his head around and saw Zhao Ye and his other direct disciples looking at him in agitation. Kong Shiyao's ancient sage ordeal had caused such a massive phenomenon to occur, shaking the entire Tianxian kingdom. As ancient sage cultivators, there was no way Zhao Ye and the others would not be alarmed by the happenings. Little junior? Kong Shiyao was a little conflicted to hear that term. She was the #1 genius of the Wuxia domain, a descendant of Kong Shi. To call a bunch of youths younger than her senior, she really could not bring herself to do it. Just as Kong Shiyao was at a loss as to what to do, Zhang Shi suddenly spoke up. She can't be considered your junior yet. She isn't my direct disciple, but a normal student that I have accepted. A normal student that you have accepted? Kong Shiyao's body trembled at those words. It was just a moment ago that she had thought that it would be incredibly awkward being their little junior. But Zhang Xian spoke, as if she did not even have the rights to be their little junior. She turned to glare at Zhang Xian with gritted teeth, wanting to protest against that clear insult, only to have Zhang Shi turn to her and ask, "Do you think that I am humiliating you?" Knowing that it would be improper for her to challenge her teacher publicly, she swallowed her indignation and lowered her head. I wouldn't dare. Nevertheless, the clenched fists by her side fully expressed her true feelings. As the phoenix of the Wuxia domain, she felt that it was ridiculous that she did not even have the right to become the little junior of a bunch of youths. It's fine, there's no need to hold back before me. I know your thoughts. Why don't we do this then? Zhao Ye is my direct disciple, and in terms of age, she's much younger than you, Zhang Xian said as he gestured toward Zhao Ye. Without any weapons in hand, the two of you will just fight with your raw strength. If you are able to win against her, I'll accept you as my direct disciple and allow you to become their senior. Very well. Caught up in the moment, Kong Shiyao looked at Zhao Ye with fighting will burning in her eyes. The other party appeared to be 18 or so, which made the other party much younger than her. If she could not even defeat such an opponent, what right did she have to be Kong Shi's descendant? After receiving Kong Shiyao's approval, Zhang Xian turned to look at Zhao Ye and said, "Just do what you usually do, and it will be enough." Yes, Zhao Ye replied with a nod before moving toward the empty clearing ahead. With a polite gesture, she invited Kong Shiyao forward. Please. Kong Shiyao also quickly walked over. There was no exchange of words or taunting before the battle started, but with their dignity on their line, a tense and competitive atmosphere could be felt between the two. Kong Shiyao did not use her bloodline ability, but as a top-notch genius and a blood reincarnation realm cultivator, she executed innumerable battle techniques one after another impeccably, making her movements appear like an elegant dance. On the other hand, Zhao Ye activated her unique constitution, causing a cold aura to grip the entire area. Beautiful snowflakes fell from the sky as a result of her ability. Her cultivation had reached Ancient Sage 2 Dan Great Philosopher Realm primary stage, after the attempted assassination on the newly inaugurated Sovereign Chen Yong a month back. However, over the past month, she had received her teacher's direct pointers and an ample supply of blood reincarnation realm Ancient Sage blood, which had allowed her to reinforce her foundations to their limits and eventually reach Great Philosopher Realm consummation. While she had not made too many breakthroughs within this period of time, it would be foolish if one simply assessed her by her cultivation. It was true that there was a fatal rift between her and Kong Shiyao's cultivation, but through her strong foundations and her deep understanding of battle, she was actually able to stand her ground against Kong Shiyao's pressing offense. The intense battle proceeded, and gradually, one could see anxiety seeping into Kong Shiyao's eyes. There should have been an absolute gap in their strength, given her higher cultivation realm and her prowess as Kong Shi's descendant. Yet in a fair battle where both of them were wielding no weapons, she was actually unable to claim the upper hand. How in the world did Zhang Xian's 18-year-old, or something direct disciple become so powerful? This won't do. At this rate, even if I win, my honor will be sullied. She wanted to prove that her talents were far beyond any of Zhang Xian's direct disciples. But if it was so difficult for her to defeat Zhao Ye despite her higher cultivation, it would actually be no different from suffering a defeat. Clenching her teeth tightly, she abruptly changed her movement technique, and in an instant, many afterimages of her appeared on the battlefield. This was the battle technique that Kong Shi had specially created for his descendants, as well as the strongest skill that she had at the moment. Massacre of the Eight Arms. Dang dang dang. Innumerable attacks flew forth from the seemingly omnipresent Kong Shiyao at a rapid pace. It was not long before Zhao Ye was cornered, and she was forced to retreat again and again. While Kong Shiyao had just achieved a breakthrough, there was no questioning that she was someone who had been through 4 ancient sage ordeals, making her an exceptionally powerful existence even among blood reincarnation realm cultivators. If not for Zhao Ye's superior combat experience, she would have already lost. Don't panic. You are only lacking in absolute strength at the moment. Since that's the case, all you have to do is achieve a breakthrough. With a flick of his finger, Zhang Xian sent a droplet of the blood essence of the deity over to Zhao Ye, who, swallowing the blood droplet, Zhao Ye's cultivation immediately began surging. Honglong. In less than 20 breaths, she had already overcome her current bottleneck to reach the blood reincarnation realm. With the tremendous surge in her strength as a result of her breakthrough, she released a burst of cold energy that swiftly sent Kong Shiyao flying into the distance before crashing onto the ground. I have lost, Kong Shiyao muttered with a pale face. She still had many more moves that she had not used, and she knew that she definitely would have been able to win if she had used her bloodline ability. However, this was not a life and death match, and she could not bring herself to use it at this moment. While the other party's battle techniques were not as profound as hers, every single one of her movements carried a deep conception behind it, making it hard to fathom her movements. On top of that, the other party seemed to be able to see through her flaws, intentionally striking at places where she could hardly defend. As a result, she was being slowly cornered. She could still rely on her superior cultivation to bridge the gap in their skills earlier on. But after Zhao Ye's cultivation reached the blood reincarnation realm, it had become a completely one-sided battle. It was truly laughable how she had looked down on this group of youths prior to the battle. In terms of talent, they were in no way beneath her. How is it? Are you still indignant at being called their little junior? Seeing how the proud genius of the Kungsa domain was still having trouble coming to terms with her defeat, Zhang Xian suggested, if you feel that it's unfair because Zhao Ye is the strongest of them all, you can feel free to challenge the others. However, I'll have to ask you to suppress your cultivation in order to ensure fairness. This, Kong Shiyao turned to look at the rest of Zhang Xian's direct disciples. Zheng Yang, Yuan Tao, Wei Ruyan, and the others were looking at her with excited gleams in their eyes. It seemed like they were dying to challenge and bully her so as to put her in place. It's fine. I'm willing to accept my position as the little junior. Kong Shiyao lowered her head and bowed down. Since they had all been groomed by the same teacher, it was likely that they would be similar in terms of strength. She had thought that she could suppress Zhao Ye with her superior cultivation, but that did not work in the end. She did not think that she would be able to best the rest of Zhang Xian's students. Since she was not confident in her strength, there was no need for her to go through with that and humiliate herself. It would be best for her to just acknowledge it. That would be for the best, Zhang Xian said. Zhao Ye, Zheng Yang, and the rest of you, from today on, Kong Shiyao will be your little junior, as well as my 9th direct disciple. You must take care of one another, got it? Yes, we'll listen to your teachings. The others clasped their fists and replied resoundingly. Seeing that even a descendant of Kong Shi had ended up acknowledging Zhang Xian as her teacher, ancient sage Yin Qing found himself rendered speechless. It was not until a long time later that he finally found his voice once more. Since Shi Yao has achieved a breakthrough to ancient sage and reached the blood reincarnation realm, she is qualified to become the new leader of the Wuxia domain and the 100 schools of philosophers. Since the Wuxia domain had been left behind by Kong Shi himself, it went without saying that it should be managed by his descendants. In the past few years, he had just been taking care of the Wuxia domain and the 100 schools of philosophers in her place. Since Kong Shiyao had grown and matured, it was time for him to pass the baton back to her. The 100 schools of philosophers had always held Kong Shi as its central figure, so there was no one who would voice any objections with Kong Shiyao becoming their leader after her breakthrough to ancient sage. With this, it meant that Zhang Xian and his 9 direct disciples had mankind, the otherworldly demonic tribe, and even the 100 schools of philosophers under their control. Knowing that she carried heavy responsibility on her shoulders, Kong Shiyao turned to her teacher and asked, "Teacher, how should we deal with the matter concerning the Wuxia domain's seal?" Her teacher had said that he would be able to resolve everything as long as she acknowledged him as her teacher. "Let me give it a try." Zhang Xian walked up to the seal, and with a thought, he took a golden page from his glabella. The golden page flew over to the seal of the Wuxia domain and swiftly fused together with it, following which, the seal quickly morphed into a massive majestic gate. As soon as this massive majestic gate appeared, the roaring lightning and crackling flames in the sky, as if having met their nemesis, quickly dissipated. The crisis has been resolved just like that. Everyone was stupefied. They had been wondering where they could find Dimension Shatter Realm experts to save them from their plight. But who could have known that everything would be resolved so easily with a single golden page? If everything was that easy, why did Zhang Xian not take it out earlier? Disregarding the looks of discontentment directed at him, Zhang Xian heaved a sigh of relief. It seems like everything worked out as I thought. In truth, he had been rather uncertain about the limits of the Library of Heaven's Path's abilities. At the very start, the first limitation that he had found was that the Library of Heaven's Path was unable to see through the flaws of ancient sages. Perhaps it was because ancient sages were existences on par with the heavens, and that was its bottleneck. However, when Luo Ruoxin fused the Great Codex of Spring and Autumn with his Library of Heaven's Path prior to her departure, this bottleneck had been removed. Back then, he had wondered if the Library of Heaven's Path tier had already exceeded the heavens of the Master-Teacher continent, and from the earlier result that he had seen, that seemed to be the case. The heavens would not dare punish a higher existence than them, and the Library of Heaven's Path and the Golden Pages happened to be such existences. With a seal formed by a golden page, viewed to be a higher existence than the heavens of the Master-Teacher continent, the result was clear. There was no way the heavens would dare pass their judgment upon the Wuxia domain anymore. As long as the seal formed by the golden page existed, the heavens of the Master-Teacher continent would dare not barge their way in. In fact, it didn't matter whether the Wuxia domain remained hidden or not anymore. Satisfied with the results, Zhang Xian glanced at Kong Shiyao and said, "I would like to pay a visit to the ancestral residence of the Kong clan." Kong Shiyao quickly walked forward and led the way back to the Wuxia domain. The ancestral residence of the Kong clan was located in the vicinity of the great frontistery of Confucianism. Zhang Xian strolled casually around it. The Kong clan had inherited Kong Shi's heritage, and it aimed to push forward his ideals and cultivation techniques. There was a strong scholarly atmosphere drifting in the residence, and with every step that Zhang Xian took, he could vaguely feel Kong Shi's spirit and philosophy. After taking a look around the Kong clan, Zhang Xian left the Wuxia domain. This time, he did not take his direct disciples with him, wanting to take a walk around. Kong Shi had once toured around the entire Master-Teacher continent, and it had given him a much deeper comprehension of life. It was the spark that had led him to create the overpowered treasure known as the Great Codex of Spring and Autumn. Zhang Xian wanted to see the Master-Teacher continent as it was for himself as well, and through doing so, he hoped to rediscover who he was. Every city that he went to, he would stop for a period of time to experience the local culture. With the threat of the otherworldly demonic tribe resolved, the world was in a rare state of peace. The Master-Teacher Pavilion had also been reorganized according to Yang Shi's plans, destroying the previous aggregation of power through factions. At this moment, it had become an organization dedicated to imparting wisdom to the world. Under Zhang Xian's instructions, his direct disciples had scattered around the world to spread his teachings. Many of his past students from the Hongyuan Master Teacher Academy had traveled around the world to lecture as well. Often, those who heard Zhang Xian's teaching through these indirect sources stumbled upon sudden bouts of enlightenment in the midst of the lectures, inducing a huge leap in their fighting prowess. As a result, their skills tended to surpass their peers. More often than not, those people would then become advocates of the Zhang school of thought. In a short period of time, Zhang Xian's reputation as the #1 master teacher of the world grew greater and greater, such that the significance of his name was almost becoming synonymous with that of Kong Shi's. There was no one in this world who did not dream of hearing a lesson directly from Zhang Shi himself, but it was as if the person in question had evaporated from the face of the world. No one knew where he was or where he had gone. It was not just the Master-Teacher Pavilion who did not know of his whereabouts. Even his direct disciples had no clue as to where their teacher had gone. No matter how they tried to contact him, there was simply no response. Just where has teacher gone? Zheng Yang sighed deeply. He had flown to the southernmost hemisphere of the Master-Teacher continent, but there was no one who had seen his teacher at all. Zhaoye had flown to the extreme north, but her search had ended in futility. Zhang Xian's 9 direct disciples had searched for 4 months, and they had scoured nearly every nook and cranny of the Master-Teacher continent, but their teacher remained nowhere to be seen. It's likely that our teacher is trying to find his own route, and doesn't want to be disturbed right now. He should be fine, so there's no need for us to worry excessively about him, Wang Ying consoled. Wang Ying is right, Lu Chong said. What we should do right now is not search for our teacher, but follow his instructions and impart his wisdom to all parts of the world. Furthermore, we must make sure to keep up with our cultivation. We should aim to reach blood reincarnation realm consummation as soon as possible, so that we can share some of his burden. That's right. The others nodded in agreement. With their teacher's current strength, there was no one on the Master-Teacher continent who could possibly pose a threat to him anymore. As such, there was indeed no need for them to worry. Their time would be better used on accomplishing the mission that he had entrusted to them, and raising their cultivation. At the very least, when the time came, they would not be mere baggage to their teacher anymore. While the world was searching for his whereabouts, Zhang Xian was strolling leisurely in a remote town on the Master-Teacher continent. It had been almost half a year since he left the 100 schools of philosophers, which also meant that it had been 2 years since he had come to this world. Over the past half a year, he had seen countless joys and sorrows, reunions and separations, the laughter of happiness, the cries of misery, the warmth of an embrace, the coldness of a rejection. Taking in the emotions and experiences of those around him, Zhang Xian felt as if he was living many different lives at once. Today marked the 3rd day since he had arrived in this little town, and going by his previous routine, it was about time for him to leave. Taking one last look at the small, peaceful town around him, Zhang Xian was just about to leave through the gates when a commotion suddenly broke out along the streets. Many people were rushing toward a common destination in agitation. Hurry up, hurry up. A master teacher is here to spread his teaching. It's said that the master teacher is here to impart Zhang Shi's wisdom. We have to make sure to record it well. As long as we listen carefully and learn well, we might get a chance to obtain green sprout wheat. Wow, that would really be great. Green sprout wheat is only cultivated only by the 100 school of philosophers, and it can't be grown on the Master-Teacher continent, right? Do you know that blacksmith in the other village? Just the other day, he ate a single stalk of green sprout wheat, and immediately achieved a breakthrough to the Zhongshe realm. That lucky bastard. If I could achieve a breakthrough to the Zhongshe realm, I'd be laughing even in my sleep. Such discussions could be heard here and there. A lecture. Zhang Xian noted before shaking his head with a smile. He had seen too many of such scenes in his journey over the past half a year, so he had completely lost interest listening to such stuff. There were many master teachers who used his name to bulk up their reputation. Some of their lectures were highly profound and induced deeper thoughts in the listener, whereas others were riddled with flaws. However, Zhang Xian never stood up to intervene in any of those. He had chosen to take the role of a bystander in the world in order to witness the different aspects of the world with an open mind. So he had resolved himself to put aside his pride, beliefs, and even identity. I should move on to the next town, Zhang Xian thought as he walked out of the city gates. However, what he caught sight of with a quick glance caused him to stop in his tracks. It's her, Zhang Xian murmured as a beautiful profile came into his line of sight. Her demure silhouette remained unchanged even after the passing of 2 years, attracting eyes whenever she passed. However, she was no longer an ordinary teacher in a humble academy. She had become a true master teacher, and a 3-star one at that. Pleased to meet you. I am Shen Bairu, a 3-star master teacher. Standing on the stage, the young lady faced the agitated audience before her and revealed a charismatic smile. Shen Bairu was the beautiful teacher working at the Hongtian Academy, whom Zhang Xian had met after he transcended over to this world. When he left the Tianxian kingdom, it had felt like their paths had begun to diverge from one another, and they would never intersect ever again. Half a year earlier, when he returned to the Tianxian kingdom, he had only met Lu Sun. He honestly did not think that he would meet Shen Bairu here, and he did not expect her to have become a 3-star master teacher so swiftly. Her presence made Zhang Xian halt in his footsteps as he turned around to look at the young lady on the stage. The young lady raised her hand and waited for the commotion amid the crowd to die down before continuing on. Zhang Laosher and I used to be colleagues. Colleagues? What? Is she saying that she knows Zhang Shi? She is bragging, isn't she? All those who claim to spread Zhang Shi's teaching say that they know Zhang Shi one way or another in an attempt to add credibility to their words. Isn't that so? I never would have thought that a lady as pretty as her would stoop to such a level. As Zhang Xian's reputation flourished, more and more people began passing themselves off as his students. Even a city as remote as this was not completely immune to this major trend. On the other hand, seeing the beautiful teacher who had always maintained a transcendental attitude toward worldly affairs talking about him in her first sentence, Zhang Xian could not help but shake his head as a hint of disappointment surfaced in his eyes. In his mind, she had always been a person who was driven by self-improvement and thought little of fame and glory. He did not think that she would use his name in order to elevate her own standing. Heaving a deep sigh, Zhang Xian was just about to leave when the young lady continued speaking. He has already become the world's teacher, and his teachings have spread far and wide. Many take pride in receiving the knowledge that he preaches, but I don't think that it's something enviable or particularly noble. Those words made Zhang Xian halt in his footsteps once more. Most of the crowd, who had planned to leave after seeing that it was just another fraud using Zhang Shi's name to her own advantage, quickly turned around with deep frowns on their foreheads. Zhang Shi's accomplishments and wisdom had struck a deep chord with everyone in the world, making him the next idol of faith since Kong Shi. Yet, she dared say that his work was not particularly noble? What did she mean by that? The atmosphere swiftly grew tense as displeased expressions appeared all over the crowd. The world is a diverse place. Take this little town that you live in, for example. While we need people standing above the clouds, we also need those whose feet are planted on the ground. The master teachers who spread their teachings and bring wisdom to the world are worthy of respect. But so are the butchers who slaughter pigs, the vendors who barter their vegetables, and the merchants who ship goods from one place to another. Every occupation in the world has its own reason for existence. There's no need to classify them by honor or prestige. What truly makes the difference is whether we are willing to put our blood and sweat into what we do, and whether we truly love what we do as well. Zhang Shi loves the master-teacher occupation with a passion. He finds purpose in bringing wisdom to others, and he enjoys uncovering the secrets of the world. His diligence and passion paid off, allowing him to reach the peak of the master-teacher occupation. I am just an ordinary person. I have neither the talents nor capabilities that he possesses. However, that doesn't mean that I am a lesser being than him. I do what I can do to impart knowledge to my students and pass down the correct values to them. Unlike him, my lectures aren't great enough to reach every corner of the world. However, I can ensure that my own teachings will not lead my students down the wrong path. And whatever knowledge I pass down has been personally verified by myself. And I think that's enough. Living in this world, we must be cognizant of our own limits and walk down a path that is suited for us. Over the past 2 years, I have toured around the world and met many people. A lot of them take pride in living in the same era as the world's teacher, Zhang Xian. Just like Kong Shi's era. They believe that this era will usher mankind to greater prosperity than before, and that we are blessed to be living in such times. I don't disagree with what they said, but while we are living in the era of hopes and dreams, does it necessarily mean that we stand a chance of rising to the top and becoming a powerful expert of the world? Bleak. It is a hopelessly bleak notion, regardless of which era one lives in. Only a small handful of people have the capacity to rise to the very top. The infuriated crowd slowly fell silent at those words. It was sad but cruel truth. Regardless of which era one was in, it was impossible for everyone to become an expert. Kong Shi dreamt of a world where all humans were powerful. But this vision was bound to remain nothing more than a dream. It was something that could never be realized. There were simply too many limitations in the world that prevented it from happening. The scarce resources, the aptitude one was born with, the intense competition among cultivators. It was because power was always held in the hands of the minority that becoming an expert was something that so many desired. I never thought that she would come to such a realization. Zhang Xian was stunned as well. He had thought that Shen Bairu was using his reputation to elevate her standing. But who could have known that she would be using this to tell a powerful story to the crowd? What was scary was not a lack in talent, but the failure to realize one's limitations. If a person who only had the ability of an ordinary soldier forced their way to become a commander, they would be hurting not just themselves. Stop listening to her bullshit. I have heard that there are those who aren't too talented among Zhang Shi's students, but all of them eventually became powerful experts. Indeed, as long as we find a good teacher, we'll be able to rise to greater heights. Do you expect us to believe that you are Zhang Shi's colleague just because you said so? All of the figures whom Zhang Shi is associated with are people far beyond our league. How could a mere 3-star master teacher like you possibly know him? After the brief moment of astonished silence came a massive uproar. Shen Bairu's words had pricked the self-esteem of the crowd. They could not accept what she was saying. Failure could always be attributed to timing and luck. An author could always say that their work was meant to go down in history as the greatest work ever made. But due to the editor's lack of foresight, their talent ended up being buried, resulting in them being unable to receive even a contract. Having expected such an uproar from the crowd, Shen Bairu raised her hand and continued calmly. I know that my words have hurt many of you, but touch your heart. Do you believe that my words are all empty? I know that I can't begin to compare to Zhang Shi, the respected world's teacher. But how many of you believe that he is truly happy with his life? The greater one's strength, the greater one's responsibility. Over the past year, he has changed the rules of the master-teacher continent, quelled the otherworldly demonic tribe, and subordinated the 100 schools of philosophers. But which of these accomplishments didn't require him to risk his life? If you were in his position, and all you wanted was to enjoy the luxuries of power, would you really have braved through danger to achieve all of that? Most of those who had spoken up against Shen Bairu earlier were struck speechless once more. Indeed, if they enjoyed Zhang Shi's standing and talent, would they really have been willing to charge into the midst of the otherworldly demonic tribe, to quell them, or confront the legendary 100 schools of philosophers? You might think that Zhang Shi is a lofty figure far beyond any of you. But back when I was working in the same academy as him, he was a teacher who was despised and looked down by others. He scored a 0 for his teacher qualification examination, so he was nearly expelled from the school. Yet, despite these challenges, He never gave up nor shied away. A step at a time, he eventually rose to his current prominence. If you were in his place, would you have been able to overcome the odds? Shen Bairu asked. Zhang Xian's life had already been compiled into books and spread across the entire world. His life had been fraught with danger, but none of the challenges that he had faced had ever convinced him to give up. If they had been in his place, would they really have been able to do the same? Most of those amid the crowd pondered the question, but they eventually shook their heads in response. For those who were weak-minded, the scorn that Zhang Xian had received at Hongtian Academy would have been more than enough for them to give up and drown their sorrows with alcohol. For those who were a little more strong-willed, the Tianwu Kingdom would probably have been where their journey ended. They would never have been able to overcome all of those obstacles that Zhang Xian had faced to live the brilliant life that he did. It was easy to envy others, but the experiences that others had gone through might have been something that they would not have been able to survive. Your own life, your own decisions. You have to recognize who you truly are in order to make the decisions that will make your life a meaningful one. Zhang Xian thought. Shen Bairu's words had truly left a mark in him. It was as if someone had ignited all of the experiences that he had been through over the past half a year, causing a raging flame to burn within him. Be it famed mountains or beautiful lakes, the warmth and callousness of human emotions, everything that he had witnessed and been involved in had become a part of his memories. Those memories strung together to form a complete him. They drifted into the sky of the master-teacher continent and overlooked the world, as if a transcendent being. In an instant, Zhang Xian seemed to enter a deep state of concentration. A lot of the confusion in his heart vanished, and the cultivation that had remained stagnant over the past half a year abruptly surged forth like water charging through a collapsed dam. The reason Zhang Xian had chosen to cast himself aside and tour the world was due to the confusion in his heart. He had found himself lost, and he needed some directions. He had looked at Kong Shi's records, but their lives had been vastly different. As two completely different people, he could not hope to experience the same things as Kong Shi even if he forced himself to retrace Kong Shi's footsteps. He knew that becoming the world's teacher was the way for him to become an ancient sage. But how could he do it? The world was such a huge place, and it was governed by its own laws. It was not as if his words could reach the heavens. So how could he become the world's teacher? Unable to make sense out of this, he had found himself falling into a stalemate. No matter how he struggled, he had been unable to advance any further at all. Of course, he knew that this confusion was something that all cultivators had to eventually face in their lifetime. But this was a hurdle that he had no idea where he could begin to work on. All along, he had been reliant on the Library of Heaven's path for his cultivation. He would collect books and compile them together, and if required, he would edit them accordingly. All in all, none of what he had practiced so far could be said to be his own creation. While he had been able to advance swiftly through this manner, it had also become his limitation. He was able to modify any cultivation technique until he had ensured that it was completely flawless. But the reliance on this ability had made him unable to cultivate without any cultivation technique to refer to. This was his greatest flaw, and he was suffering as a result of it. Even the heavens were flawed, so there was nothing in this world that came without compromise. Thus, he had set out on his journey to see the world. He did not know how long it would take, and it did not know where it would lead him to, but it was all he could do. This journey had been an eye-opener. It had allowed him to understand many aspects of the world that he had never noticed before. However, when he heard Shen Bairu's words, it made him realize something. The answer that he had been searching for over the past half a year was not something that he could find anywhere else in the world. It existed only in himself. All he had to do was be the best him. Why should he be so bothered with the experiences of others? Everyone in the world had their own path to tread on, so there was no need for him to conform to others. What he had to do was stay loyal to his own heart and continue paving his path forward. That would be enough. Even if there was no perfect cultivation technique for him to cultivate, and he could not truly become the world's teacher, he would just have to ensure that he remained the perfect him. And that was enough. Thank you, Shen Bairu. Feeling the changes in his body, Zhang Xian smiled. He had found his own answer, and he was finally ready to achieve a breakthrough to ancient sage. The surroundings fell silent. Zhang Xian's words were not particularly loud, but they attracted the attention of the crowd in an instant. Hearing that voice, Shen Bairu turned her gaze over, and her eyes widened in astonishment. Zhang Laoshi, what are you doing here? If Zhang Xian did not want others to recognize him, not even his closest students would see through his disguise. But out of gratitude for Shen Bairu, he did not want to conceal his identity to her. As such, the young lady was able to tell that he was the despised and scorned teacher who had been on the verge of being expelled from Hongtian Academy 2 years ago, Zhang Xian. His appearance did not seem to have changed by too much over the past 2 years, other than his taller profile, his smoother skin, and his deeper eyes. It has been a very long time since we last met. Zhang Xian replied with a warm smile, as he slowly made his way up to the stage. Yes, it has been a long time. Shen Bairu nodded as her body trembled in agitation. She had thought that with the difference in their standings, there was no way that they would ever meet again. Who could have known that their reunion would come so abruptly? The young man was just the same as ever. His posture was without airs, and his smile was still so innocent. Zhang Shi, she mentioned earlier that she was colleagues with Zhang Shi, and now, she's acting so shocked all of a sudden. Is she trying to say that the fellow over there is the world's teacher, Zhang Shi? It's one thing for her to feed us with so much crap earlier, but to make such a bold claim. Is she trying to insult our intelligence? She really is trying to grind our tolerance down to the very last bit, isn't she? If he really is Zhang Shi, I am the head of the Master Teacher Pavilion. How could a lofty figure like Zhang Shi possibly come to a remote town like ours? This woman might be pretty, but she sure has a devious heart. The two of them did not try to conceal their words, and their exchange caused the crowd below to explode, as if someone had thrown gunpowder in the midst of burning flames. While Zhang Shi was a figure whom all of them respected, they also understood that the other party was a figure extremely far away from them. It had never crossed their minds that they would ever be able to meet Zhang Shi in person. Yet, that young lady had actually called out Zhang Laoshi so abruptly after making such a speech. Was she trying to say that this humble-looking fellow was actually Zhang Xian? You must be trying to make a monkey out of us. We can accept your bragging, but to sully Zhang Shi's honor? Unforgivable. Don't you know that passing yourself off as Zhang Shi is a taboo of the Master Teacher Pavilion? You must be punished for your insolence, or else how can the Master Teacher Pavilion establish its credibility in the world? A Master Teacher amid the crowd cried out in fury. Indeed. Catch those two despicable scoundrels. Catch them and skin. Another person amid the crowd shouted. But before he could finish his words, a quivering voice suddenly echoed in the air. Shut up. What's going on over there? The infuriated crowd looked at the stage, and what they saw nearly blew their minds. The young man passing off as Zhang Shi, with a gentle smile on his face, was slowly rising into the air. It was a common fact that flight was an ability exclusive to cultivators who had reached the saint realm. Could the imposter before them actually be a saint expert? But before they could figure out what was going on, a loud rumbling echoed in the air as countless ominous clouds gushed over. The span of the ominous clouds was massive. It swiftly covered the entire town, but it still continued to grow relentlessly into the distance. It did not take long for it to extend all the way to the horizon, plunging everywhere into darkness. This is a cultivation ordeal? How could there be such a massive cultivation ordeal? It's rumored that even the most formidable ancient sage ordeal only covers up to 100,000 mu. But this is at least 1,000,000 mu, right? The crowd below was completely stunned. To be able to summon such a huge cultivation ordeal, could that young man really be Zhang Shi? As this doubt was raised, the crowd swiftly fell silent. Indeed, other than Zhang Shi, who could cause such a spectacular uproar in the world? At the Glacier Playing Court, Mother, rest assured, I'll take care of my body, and I'll make sure not to act recklessly. A young lady with features reminiscent of a delicate ice sculpture reassured a middle-aged lady with a gentle smile. She was the court chief of the Glacier Playing Court, Zhaoya. The middle-aged lady before her was the holy maiden of the previous generation, her mother. Back then, after the conflict between her teacher and the other major powers was resolved in Empire Alliance City, she had quickly returned to the Glacier Plain court to release her mother. She had brought her mother back to the Tianxian kingdom to reunite with her father for a while before taking them all to the Glacier Plain court. You keep going into seclusion to cultivate, neither eating nor drinking. A middle-aged man walked over as he shook his head disapprovingly. Your mother and I are afraid that you are pushing yourself too much. He was Zhao Ye's father, the lord of Tianxian Kingdom's Bayou City Zhaofeng. After Zhang Shi disappeared, their daughter had gone around the world searching for him desperately. When she was unable to find him even after some time, she had finally decided to return to the Glacier Plain court. But as soon as she returned, she had devoted her time to cultivating, neglecting to sleep and everything else. It pained his heart to see his daughter living in such a manner. While their daughter had reached a level far beyond what they could imagine, their daughter's attitude of recklessly plunging into any danger, as long as it could raise her cultivation, was a cause for concern. They felt that she would eventually come to harm as a result of this. I'm fine. I just wish to be able to stand before my teacher proudly when he finally returns, so that he won't be disappointed in me. Zhao Ye replied with a smile. The memories that she shared with her teacher flashed through her head and filled her with strength once more. She was just about to placate her parents before returning to her cultivation when her eyebrows suddenly shot up. She hurriedly raised her head, only to see that the distant sky had already been covered by large swathes of ominous clouds, and it was swiftly creeping toward the Glacier Plain court. 1 mu equals 666. 6 square meters. This is... Zhao Ye immediately shot to her feet in shock. This was because she realized that even with her current cultivation, she was unable to see the entire span of the ominous clouds. Due to her hard work over the past half a year, her cultivation had already reached blood reincarnation realm consummation. Of course, she was still nowhere close to pushing for a breakthrough to the Dimension Shatterer realm, but there was no doubt that her strength was more than enough to put her at the top of the world. Despite that, she was actually unable to see the end of the ominous clouds. Did this not mean that the ominous clouds extend over several 100,000 li? What in the world is this? How could there be such a huge congregation of dark clouds here? Zhao Feng and his wife also swiftly noticed that something was amiss, and they were horrified by what they were seeing. It seems to be a cultivation ordeal. Teacher. That's right, my teacher must be back. Zhao Ye's eyes lit up in excitement. Not in the mood to cultivate anymore, she quickly rushed in the direction of where the ominous clouds had come from. Other than her teacher, there was no one in the world who was able to summon such a huge congregation of clouds. He was the one and only one in the world. A teacher seeks to impart knowledge and clarify doubts. While our combat master hall does not have the capacity to impart wisdom, we can still demystify combat techniques and fighting skills. This is aligned with the responsibilities of a teacher. And that's also why we are a subsidiary of the Master Teacher Pavilion, instead of a separate organization. Standing in front of an army of 10,000, Zheng Yang looked at the newly recruited combat master sternly as he spoke. Over the past half a year, the Combat Master Hall had grown significantly stronger, especially after Zheng Yang passed down the knowledge that he had received from Zhang Xian. The members of the Combat Master Hall were stronger than ever, each of them wielding the strength to fend off hundreds of cultivators simultaneously. We understand. The crowd nodded in agitation. All of them had heard of the incredible deeds of the Hall Master and his teacher, and they looked forward to becoming a part of the legend they were creating. It was their dearest wish to follow behind this esteemed young man, and their wish was coming true. Seeing that everyone was pumped up, Zheng Yang stopped his speech right there. All right, we shall start the training for today. He was just about to gesture for the instructors to begin when he suddenly raised his head and saw darkness creeping in from afar. Those dark clouds. Is it a cultivation ordeal? Zheng Yang was stunned for a moment before realization struck him. It's my teacher. He's going to achieve a breakthrough to Ancient Sage. With a slight push against the ground, he vanished right from the spot. In the capital of the otherworldly demonic tribe, Lu Yang was seated upon a high throne, looking down upon his subjects. With a cold voice carrying unquestionable authority, he commanded, "I have mentioned this far too many times, and it bores me to repeat myself time and time again. All otherworldly demons are to maintain friendly relations with the humans, and conflicts are to be avoided at all costs. Anyone who infringes on this will be killed without fail. Do I still have to teach you what to do?" The otherworldly demons quickly kneeled on the ground fearfully and replied, "Yes, Your Majesty. We'll carry out your will." Shortly after his inauguration, the new sovereign Shenyong had implemented a series of swift but severe reforms. Under his efforts, the otherworldly demons were starting to accept their coexistence with the humans, and the initial tension between the two races was starting to calm down. Of course, a feud that had lasted over tens of thousands of years could not be halted so easily, but at the very least, the battles had stopped for the time being. Eventually, time would wash away the hostility between the two races, ushering in an era of stability and harmony. Not to mention, coexistence with the humans was not without benefits for the otherworldly demons either. The otherworldly demons gained access to the precious resources traded on the Master-Teacher continent, and they were also able to develop their industries through implementing the technologies of the humans. Having experienced the benefits of coexistence, there were some factions among the otherworldly demonic tribe who were starting to openly support the new sovereign Shenyong's policies. More importantly, Sovereign Shenyong had started pushing out a new set of cultivation techniques that allowed otherworldly demons to cultivate swiftly even if they did not devour the flesh and souls of master teachers and humans. With the mutual benefits of the two races aligned, the friction between them lessened significantly. "All right, we shall end the court here. You are dismissed." With a wave of his hand, Lu Yang stood up to walk away. As a sign of respect, the subjects were only allowed to leave after the emperor had left the royal court. However, at that moment, ominous clouds suddenly swarmed over from afar, covering the sky in a flash. "Teacher!" Lu Yang's eyes reddened in agitation at this sight. Without any hesitation, he flicked his wrist and tore open a spatial passageway. He walked into the spatial passageway and disappeared from the astonished eyes of his subjects. After his hard work over the past half a year, the situation in the otherworldly demonic tribe had finally stabilized. He finally had the rights to pursue his teacher once more. The same situation was occurring in the 100 schools of philosophers' Wuxia domain. Kong Shiyao looked at the gloomy sky as her body trembled in excitement. Was her teacher finally appearing once more after his long absence? "I'll leave the Wuxia domain to you for the time being. I'm heading out to take a look." Without waiting for the other party to respond, Kong Shiyao rushed toward the master-teacher continent. After spending 6 months in anonymity, Zhang Xian finally caused a huge uproar in the world with his breakthrough. It's him. It really is him. There's no doubt. There's no one other than Zhang Shi who could pull something like this off. To think that we wouldn't be able to recognize him when he was right before our eyes. And we even attempted to capture him. My gosh, I actually got a chance to see Zhang Shi's splendor with my own eyes. Now I can die with no regrets. As the truth dawned upon those in the little town, countless silhouettes gathered around the stage stiffened in shock. Previously, when Shen Bairu mentioned that she was Zhang Shi's colleague, there had not been a single person among the crowd who believed her. When she said that the young man standing before them was actually Zhang Shi, they had scoffed at her words, thinking that they were utter nonsense. All of it turned out to be real. The incredible figure, who had won the world's respect and admiration, was really standing right before them in the flesh. He's just the same as ever. He's always the brightest one in the crowd, Shen Bairu remarked with a helpless smile. For as long as she had known this young man, he had always caught everyone's gaze. She had thought that he would tone down after coming this far. But the other party turned out to be the same as ever. It was as if he did not know the concepts of humility and low profile. Zhang Xian was oblivious to the uproar among the crowd. He was carefully ruminating over his new enlightenment, and it felt as if the rays of the dawn sun had pierced through the darkness in his mind, showing him a new route. This feeling was so strong that it touched even the depths of his soul. So, this is what I've been pursuing all this while, Zhang Xian muttered with a faint smile, as he looked at the endless dark clouds and lightning bolts gathering around him. It was apparent that the cultivation ordeal that he was going to go through this time would be highly destructive, commanding a might far beyond what he had ever experienced before. Selah. Lightning bolts and heavenly flames condensed together to form innumerable massive weapons, and each of these weapons darted right toward Zhang Xian. Just from the sheer momentum, it felt like not even Dimension Shatterer realm experts would stand a chance against this fearsome might. In fact, it felt like it had far exceeded everything in the world. It was a transcendental force that was bound to bring destruction upon its target, and not even the newly enlightened Zhang Xian would stand a chance against it. But, since he did not stand a chance against it, why should he bother fighting against it? Without the slightest change in his expression, Zhang Xian parted his lips. Dissipate, his voice pierced through the void, echoing into the high heavens. Voila! As if they had encountered their greatest nemesis, the weapons made of lightning bolts and heavenly flames swiftly disintegrated into nothing. At the same time, under his command, the ominous clouds slowly scattered, returning a clear sky to the world. Previously, he would still have had to utilize all kinds of techniques in order to overcome his cultivation ordeal. But with his current ability, he was actually able to resolve it with a single word. It was as if the heavens of the Master-Teacher continent had submitted to him. He had become the ruler of the world, and his words dictated the future course of the world. This was the ability of the word of law. A breakthrough to ancient sage meant surpassing the world in a certain law, but the current Zhang Xian had gone far beyond that. His entire existence had surpassed the limitations of the world, making him a being who stood above the heavens. He had become a transcendental being that existed beyond the three realms, unrecognized by the five elements. As the ancient sage ordeal vanished, overwhelming energy gushed out from his body and pierced into the heavens, suppressing everything in the area. Boom! Unable to suppress his Jinqi any longer, Zhang Xian's aura began surging forth. In an instant, from sempiternal realm consummation, he had already reached Ancient Sage. Ancient Sage 1 Dan Bloodline Continuance Realm. Ancient Sage 2 Dan Great Philosopher Realm. Ancient Sage 3 Dan Blood Reincarnation Realm. All of the accumulation prior to his breakthrough was showing its effects now. In less than 10 breaths, he had already pushed through 3 realms, rising all the way to Blood Reincarnation Realm consummation. In a sense, his achievement was even more fearsome than Kong Shiyao's. In fact, not even Kong Shi's breakthrough had been so swift. Feeling vigorous energy coursing through his body, a smile slowly etched itself onto Zhang Xian's lips as he gazed down upon the world, as if an immortal of the heavens. At that moment, his profile looked ever so inviolable and authoritative. A long silence lingered in the world as the sky cleared up completely, following which, a majestic voice boomed across the world. From this day onward, I am the world's teacher. The 3 realms are namely the heavens, earth, and hell. From the moment he achieved a breakthrough to Ancient Sage, Zhang Xian realized that he was already an existence that towered above the Master-Teacher continent's heavens, becoming the world's teacher in reality. Every word and action from him could influence the will of the heavens, and even correct them. This was the same ability that Kong Shi's descendants wielded, word of law. He had thought that he had finally diverged from Kong Shi's path, and was no longer affected by the latter. But who could have known that he was still walking on the latter's footsteps? It was as if every step that he took brought him closer to becoming the next Kong Shi. Kong Shi must have reached such a realm in the ancient era for him to bestow upon his descendants the ability to warp the laws of the world through their words. Zhang Xian sighed deeply before shaking the matter out of his mind. It should not matter whether he was tracing Kong Shi's footsteps or not. As long as he was giving his all in everything that he did, what was the point in frustrating over such matters? With clenched fists, Zhang Xian began to carefully sense the changes in his body. Even though he had only reached the blood reincarnation realm thus far, with his current strength, he was confident that he could crush the deity that had appeared previously in the Kungsi domain with a single finger. It seemed like the many times that he had suppressed his cultivation had not been in vain. The strength that he had acquired as soon as he made the breakthrough was really beyond imagination. Kacha, the painting that Zhang Xian was holding tightly in his hand, suddenly disintegrated into ashes. In order to fuel his previous breakthrough, not only did he use up all of the aeon of ancient sage contained in the painting, he also devoured all of the ancient sage blood that he had acquired from the two deities that he had killed. At that very moment, he felt like he had reverted to his usual poor self. Wealth sure was transient. Farewell. With a tap of his finger, he imparted a modified cultivation technique into the head of the young lady, before turning around and vanishing from sight. Farewell, Zhang Xian. Shen Bairu's eyes reddened as her body shook non-stop. She knew that this parting truly represented the divergence of their pathways. They would never meet one another ever again. Meanwhile, after confirming the identity of the young man in the sky, the crowd in the town swiftly got to their knees and kneeled down, paying respects to Zhang Shi. As expected of the world's teacher, every action that he did was a legend in itself. Flying to a private location where ordinary cultivators could no longer see him, Zhang Xian halted his flight and cast a cursory glance around him. With a smile on his lips, he said, "Come out. Teacher. Zhaoye Wangying Lu Yang, Zheng Yang, Yuan Tao Lu Chong, Wei Ruyan, Zhang Jiuxiao and Kong Shiyao." His 9 direct disciples swiftly appeared from the shadows and bowed down to him. Over the past 2 years, he had accepted all 9 of them as his direct disciples. Each of them had eventually climbed to the top of the master-teacher continent, becoming figures that stood at the very peak of the pyramid. "Come at me all at once. I want to see how much you have grown," Zhang Xian said with his hands behind his back. The 9 direct disciples were stunned for a moment, before they nodded simultaneously. Ho ho ho! The 9 of them immediately encircled Zhang Xian, before charging at him from all directions. Over the past half a year, all 9 of them had made significant advances in their cultivation. Even the one with the lowest cultivation in the past, Yuan Tao, had successfully reached Great Philosopher Realm Intermediate Stage after his 2 ancient sage ordeals. As for the others, such as Zhaoye Kong Shiyao, Zheng Yang, and Lu Yang, they had all reached the Blood Reincarnation Realm. With their combined prowess, they wielded the power to seal even space-time itself. Had the deity from before come under their collaborative offense, he would have found it hard to stand his ground. But when the target was Zhang Xian, their seemingly devastating attacks were easily kept at bay by the mere protective layer of Jinqi shrouding his body. In fact, as long as Zhang Xian willed it, he could move at a speed so quick that even they would be unable to perceive his movements. At this point, the Zhang clan's bloodline was completely useless to him. Time acceleration had become an ability that he could activate with a mere thought. The group fought for a while, and it did not take long for Zhang Xian to ascertain how powerful he and each of his direct disciples were. Feeling that there was no point in prolonging the fight any longer, he raised his forefinger and tapped it lightly in front of him. Break! Voila! All 9 of them were sent retreating simultaneously with pale faces. It was no exaggeration to say that they were the most powerful team of cultivators on the master-teacher continent at the moment, but to think that they would not be able to withstand a single strike from their teacher's finger. Zhaoye and Zheng Yang, you have worked hard. I can tell that you have improved a lot over the past half a year. The rest of you too. Well done. However, Shiyao, you will have to work a little harder. Even though you aren't the weakest at the moment, your advancement is sorely lagging behind, Zhang Xian pointed out. He could tell that his students had been working extremely hard based on their improvements. In contrast, the one who had been growing the slowest turned out to be the last direct disciple that he had accepted, Kong Shiyao. He had not really given her any pointers prior to his departure, resulting in the latter's cultivation advancing only from Blood Reincarnation Realm Intermediate Stage to Advanced Stage despite having half a year to herself. As one of Zhang Xian's direct disciples, such a rate of progress could be said to be abysmal. Kong Shiyao was rendered speechless. She was painfully aware of the fact that she was the one who had made the least progress over the past half a year. Previously, she had thought that, with her Kong clan bloodline, Even if she was no match for Zhao Ye, Zheng Yang, and the others at the moment, she should be able to catch up with them in no time. Yet the others were pulling further away from her instead. This made her realize that the incredible gifts that the Kong clan's bloodline had bestowed her would only get her so far. It was sheer naivety for her to think that her talent would be enough to offset the effort put in by her seniors, who were desperately climbing forward with everything they had. If she did not desperately claw forward with everything she had, she would only end up being cast behind the others. Not to mention that her teacher was the world's teacher. There was no way the disciples of the world's teacher would be bound by the mere limitations of talent. Alright, this is what I have comprehended over the past half a year. I'll impart everything to you now. As for how much you are able to comprehend, it's entirely up to you. With a tap of his finger, Zhang Xian imparted the insights that he had received during his breakthrough to ancient sage into the minds of the others. At their level of cultivation, there was no longer a need to bring them around step by step anymore, as if they were amateurs. Rather, all he had to do was grant them the resources and allow them to reach enlightenment on their own. One's cultivation lay with oneself. As a teacher, his role was just to bring them through the doors and point out plausible paths to them. As for how far they could go, that was down to them. It was also for this reason that Zhang Xian had previously encouraged them to seek out their own paths. If not, they would not have accrued precious experiences that would allow them to grow and mature as people. The 9 direct disciples swiftly scanned through Zhang Xian's impartation, and excited gleams sparkled in their eyes. With his insights, they would be able to quicken their rate of cultivation and reinforce the foundations of their cultivation further. Zhang Xian knew that it would take some time for his direct disciples to assimilate what they had just received, but he did not have much time to waste. Thus he spoke up. I'm intending to head to the formation in the Kungsi domain. The rest of you should come along with me. The 9 of them quickly nodded in response. Thus, they made their way over to the Kungsi domain, and within 10 minutes, they were already on the elevated platform beneath the formation leading to the azure. After Zhang Xian had repaired the formation, all of the rifts that had appeared previously had been completely mended, making this place seem almost no different from any other. The mercury-like energy that had seeped through previously had also diffused into the surroundings to harmless concentration levels. From the looks of it, it seemed like the formation was doing its job well. Through the personnel guarding the formation, he confirmed that no deities had been able to slip through the formation in the past half a year, and he heaved a sigh of relief. On the other side of the formation above is the azure, and it is filled with an extremely heavy spiritual energy. It's highly dangerous, but I believe that it's the key to achieving a breakthrough to the Dimension Shatterer realm. Would you like to try and see if you are able to absorb it? Zhang Xian tapped his finger lightly as he spoke, and a small black hole appeared in the formation. A gush of heavy energy poured down, causing the elevated platform to creak under the weight. Since he had achieved a breakthrough to Ancient Sage, it was about time for him to leave the Master Teacher continent and take a look at the higher dimensions. Otherwise, he would never be able to find Luo Ruoxin, and their fate would be severed thereon. However, in order to enter the azure, he would have to first grow accustomed to the mercury-like spiritual energy. The reason he had brought his direct disciples there, as well, was because he wanted them to get a taste of the mercury-like spiritual energy, so that they would be wary of it. Tzizi, hearing Zhang Xian's words, the 9 direct disciples each took in a small bit of the mercury-like spiritual energy, and the next moment, they felt as if their meridians were going to collapse under the weight. They hurriedly drove their Jinqi to reinforce the resilience of their meridians. This spiritual energy was simply too fearsome. Even though they had all reached Ancient Sage, it was still beyond their means to deal with. Teacher, I think I am able to absorb this spiritual energy. Just as Zhang Xian was sighing in disappointment, a voice suddenly sounded. He quickly turned his head over and saw Zhao Ye looking at him with a confused expression. The mercury-like spiritual energy was slowly flowing into her body, but her body was not showing any signs of rejection. Continue cultivating, don't stop. Zhang Xian urged as he activated his eye of insight to take a closer look at the young lady. As the mercury-like spiritual energy flowed through her body, it refined her zhenqi, inducing her cultivation to grow at a visible rate. Within a short 10 minutes, she was making advancements equivalent to an entire day of cultivation. It's the altered meridians. Zhang Xian came to a realization. Previously, Zhao Ye's meridians had been completely destroyed while trying to save him, so Zhang Xian had used the vines of the Dongshu gourd to construct a new meridian network for her. This mercury-like spiritual energy should have been enough to crush the meridians of any cultivator with ease, but somehow, this problem did not exist for Zhao Ye. It was a wonder what the vines truly were. They were actually able to absorb such heavy spiritual energy without causing a strain on Zhao Ye's body at all by nullifying the damage it would have usually caused on normal cultivators through its sheer resilience. A few moments later, Zhao Ye halted her cultivation before turning to look at her teacher with agitation in her eyes. "Teacher, I think that I should be able to easily achieve a breakthrough to dimension shatter a realm, as long as I continue absorbing the heavy spiritual energy." Her cultivation had already reached blood reincarnation realm consummation, due to her hard work over the past half a year. But all of a sudden, she had found that she could not scale any higher than that. It was as if she had already reached the highest peak of the master-teacher continent, and there was no path leading to higher grounds for her to take anymore. It was the world's bottleneck. Yet, when she absorbed the spiritual energy, she actually felt an impetus to make a breakthrough, and it filled her with disbelief. "I see," Zhang Xian remarked with a nod. He did not say too much in response to Zhao Ye's situation, but he had already roughly figured out what was going on. The spiritual energy of the master-teacher continent differed far too much from the azure in terms of density and quality. The bottleneck preventing cultivators from reaching the dimension shatterer realm was like a pair of resilient steel gates that an ordinary stream could never push open. It required powerful currents and devastating waves striking on the steel gates in order to break them apart. "It's as I thought. The key to achieving a breakthrough to the dimension shatterer realm is to absorb this mercury-like energy." Zhang Xian nodded affirmatively, more certain than ever of his conjecture. This might also be the reason for the vast difference in the strength of those on the master-teacher continent and the deities descending from the azure. They had been constantly nourished by the mercury-like spiritual energy, so achieving a breakthrough to the dimension shatterer realm was not too difficult a feat to them anymore. It was for this reason that the 100 schools of philosophers had devoted their efforts to developing the green sprout wheat to improve the constitution of ordinary civilians. Once their constitution reached a level suited for them to absorb the mercury-like spiritual energy, mankind would take a qualitative step forward in its level of existence. Continue absorbing the spiritual energy. Try to achieve a breakthrough to the dimension shatterer realm if possible, Zhang Xian instructed. Zhao Ye nodded. She quickly drove her zhenqi to its limits as she devoured the mercury-like spiritual energy greedily. On the other hand, the other 8 direct disciples tried to absorb the mercury-like spiritual energy once more, but they were unable to absorb it like their first senior. Thus, they could only sigh deeply and look at their first senior in envy. Knowing that cultivation was not something that could be rushed, Zhang Xian did not rush Zhao Ye. Instead, using both the Eye of Insight and the Library of Heaven's Path, he made sure to take note of Zhao Ye's current condition carefully, fearing that something would happen to her. Fortunately, due to Zhao Ye's diligence and patience, the foundations of her cultivation were extremely firm. Her cultivation grew without any problems, and within half a day, she was already knocking on the bottleneck, keeping her from the dimension shatterer realm. Break! Once the young lady had built up sufficient momentum, her eyebrows shot up as she released a furious cry. In an instant, her zhenqi gushed through her meridians and tore down the bottleneck limiting her, causing her cultivation to rise to the much-desired level of the dimension shatterer realm. The ordeal of lightning armament swiftly descended upon Zhao Ye, as the heavens desperately tried to claw her apart. However, with her current strength and Zhang Xian's pointers, she managed to overcome the crisis safely. Nevertheless, The cultivation ordeal still left many wounds on her that would take some time to recover from. Is this the level that you reached back then? Zhang Xian asked. Vicious had reached the Dimension Shatterer realm before, which had resulted in his widespread fame in the otherworldly demonic tribe as an immortal's envoy. It was with such strength that he had been able to force Kong Shi into a corner multiple times. Vicious nodded. Through absorbing the heavy energy coming from the azure, I was able to push my cultivation past the Dimension Shatterer realm, but I was only able to push to primary stage. Anything beyond that is practically impossible. Based on my research back then, one has to enter the azure and tap into the natural energies in that world to alter one's fundamental constitution in order to advance one's cultivation any further than that. Otherwise, one will be doomed to be trapped at that realm till one's death. You were unable to advance any further than that. Zhang Xian was stunned. He quickly turned to Zhaoye and asked her the same question. Zhaoye closed her eyes to sense her current physical condition before shaking her head and replying, Teacher, it seems like reaching Dimension Shatterer realm primary stage is really my limit. If I wish to cultivate any further than this, while the rejection of the heavens does play a part as well, more importantly, it seems like my body has reached the limits of its capacity. I am unable to accept any more heavy spiritual energy. It was similar to the idea of how a pond could only store a limited amount of water, depending on its size. If someone attempted to pour more water into an already full pond, the excess would just flow into the surroundings. If one wanted the pond to reserve a greater amount of water, the only way was to expand the pond. As the size of the pond increased, the amount of water that it could store would naturally increase as well. The dimension one lives in does affect one's constitution too, Zhang Xian thought. He had thought that as long as he had an ample supply of the mercury-like spiritual energy, he would be able to continuously absorb it and advance his cultivation swiftly. However, it seemed like his thoughts were too naive. If it was that easy, Kong Shi would not have had to leave the master-teacher continent. Zhang Xian clenched his fists and thought, let me give it a try again and see if I'm able to absorb it. Previously, when he tried to absorb the mercury-like spiritual energy, he had not achieved a breakthrough to ancient sage, and the resilience of his body had still been sorely lacking. However, after his breakthrough, he wielded strength that far surpassed that of even Zhaoye. Could his body possibly be able to adapt to this mercury-like spiritual energy and allow him to absorb it too? After all, he had altered his meridian network, and it was even more profound than Zhaoye's. With such a thought in mind, Zhang Xian quickly sat on the ground and closed his eyes. Tz. The mercury-like spiritual energy swiftly poured into Zhang Xian's meridians through his acupoints. Kacha, kacha. But as if someone had injected lead into his body, his meridians immediately began cracking as he felt an incredible weight trying to pull him down from within. He hurriedly drove his Heaven's Path Shenxi to repair the cracks and reinforce his meridians to withstand the mercury-like spiritual energy. Nevertheless, his face continued to redden, and a moment later, fresh blood spurted out of his mouth. It doesn't work. Zhang Xian shook his head helplessly. He had thought that he would be able to absorb the mercury-like energy with the recent advancement in his cultivation, but his expectations had been dashed. If he attempted to force his way through, it could be foreseen that his meridians would be shattered, and his dantian would collapse. Putting aside trying to assimilate the mercury-like spiritual energy into his jinqi, his body would first be destroyed by the massive burden. It's a pity that I don't have the vine anymore. Zhang Xian sighed deeply. If he still had the vines of the Dongshu gourd, he would have been able to use it to further alter his meridians and allow him to slowly adapt to the mercury-like spiritual energy. But that was clearly out of the question now. Just as Zhang Xian was wondering if he should seek another method, a thought suddenly arose in his head. Wait a moment, that shouldn't be. Those two otherworldly demons were able to absorb the mercury-like spiritual energy, and even Vicious succeeded. Ancient sage Yanqing had once experimented with the mercury-like spiritual energy, and of the initial 10 subjects, 2 otherworldly demons had eventually survived the crushing pressure from the mercury-like spiritual energy. Vicious definitely did not have the vine of the Dongshu gourd, but he had succeeded as well, considering that his meridian network was even more perfect than the otherworldly demons. It did not make sense for him to fail. There had to be something else that they had that he did not that resulted in such a massive difference in results. Could it be the Jinchi of slaughter? If I alter the attribute of my Jinchi to that, will I be able to absorb the mercury-like spiritual energy more smoothly? Zhang Xian wondered. It was not as if there was anyone whom he could consult, so he decided to immediately try it out. He swiftly altered the attribute of his Heaven's Path Jinchi to simulate the Jinchi of slaughter, and in an instant, it was as if he had become a lofty otherworldly demon emperor. After altering the attribute of his Jinchi, he opened up his acupoints once more and carefully took in the mercury-like spiritual energy. Tizzi. This time, when the same mercury-like spiritual energy entered his body, it surprisingly did not feel as heavy as before. Instead, it felt warm and soothing, as if gulping down a bowl of warm chicken soup. It's working. Zhang Xian clenched his fists tightly in exhilaration. As the current sovereign Chun Yong, Lu Yang possessed the ability to freely alter his Jinchi to that of the Jinchi of slaughter as well. But his meridians had never been changed before. It was likely that this was why he was unable to absorb the mercury-like spiritual energy. However, it was different for Zhang Xian. Back when he was stripped down to his bones during his fight with the deity in the capital of the otherworldly demonic tribe, he had used the unique aura that the deity gifted to Sovereign Chun Ling in order to recover, and he had made sure to alter his meridian network to one that was more aligned with the world. With those changes, he was actually able to absorb the mercury-like spiritual energy smoothly without any problems. After absorbing for some time, he finally felt the bottleneck that was preventing him from reaching the dimension Shatterer realm. Shatter. At that moment, Zhang Xian's consciousness was within the Great Codex of Spring and Autumn in the Library of Heaven's Path, which resulted in a tenfold acceleration for the time of his consciousness. Mercury-like energy poured out of the azure in bulk, but every single bit of it was swiftly swept into a vortex that led straight into Zhang Xian's body. Zhaoya, Kong Shiyao, and the others were astonished, and they swiftly retreated several steps away from the elevated platform. They had noticed that their teacher was able to absorb the heavy spiritual energy ever since his aura transformed into one similar to an otherworldly demon, but they did not think that he would actually be able to cultivate so quickly. Under the relentless downpour of such a huge quantity of the mercury-like energy, the elevated platform was crushed under the pressure. Due to the effects of the Great Codex of Spring and Autumn, Zhang Xian was able to cultivate at an unbelievable speed. Nevertheless, it took him nearly an entire day before he was able to push his cultivation up to the very brim, where he was unable to accumulate any more energy. Hong Long. It was around half a day later before he finally released the energy and took the final step into the Dimension Shatterer realm, just like Zhaoya. Surprisingly though, perhaps because he had become the world's teacher, the heavens did not call an ordeal of lightning armament upon him as a result of his breakthrough. After reaching this realm, he swiftly noticed that he was facing the same problem as Vicious and Zhaoya. No matter how much he tried to absorb the mercury-like spiritual energy, he was unable to advance his cultivation in the slightest. It was as if his dantian and meridians had reached a sated state, preventing him from absorbing any more energy. What a pity, Zhang Xian remarked with a shake of his head as he halted his cultivation and rose to his feet. The advancement in his cultivation had given him a deeper understanding of what the mercury-like spiritual energy truly was. Simply put, it was spiritual energy condensed to the extremities, resulting in its unbelievable weight. As the meridians of ordinary humans were simply too weak, it was impossible for them to adapt to it. On the other hand, the otherworldly demons possessed a superior constitution, and their meridian network was much more logical than that of normal human cultivators. As such, there was a chance that they could adapt to the mercury-like spiritual energy and enjoy a significant boost in their cultivation. As for why the Jinchi of slaughter was required to cultivate the mercury-like spiritual energy, Zhang Xian did not have a clear answer yet, but he did notice that the two energies shared similar attributes to one another. Perhaps, the zhenqi of slaughter facilitated the absorption and flow of the mercury-like spiritual energy, and the similar attributes also meant that it was less likely that one's body would reject the mercury-like spiritual energy. Seeing that both Zhao Ye and their teacher had achieved a breakthrough to the dimension shadow realm one after another, Zheng Yang, Kong Shiyao, and the others could hardly contain their agitation. Teacher, is it possible for us to cultivate the heavy spiritual energy too? If the two of them were able to absorb the heavy spiritual energy, would they be able to do it in the near future? Zhang Xian shook his head grimly. For the time being, it's impossible for the rest of you. Altering the meridians of an individual was no laughing matter. Even with Zhang Xian's current means, he did not dare take the matter lightly. The reason Zhao Ye had been able to succeed was because her meridians had been replaced with the extraordinary vines of the Dongshu gourd. But even so, luck played a huge part as well. Many complications could easily have occurred, such as her succumbing to the pain or her body rejecting the vines of the Dongshu gourds. On the other hand, Zhang Xian had only managed to alter his meridians because he was already reduced to a skeleton, and he had the recovery energy from the deity that had allowed him to swiftly heal his body. Otherwise, just trying to recover would have been a pain in his backside, let alone making use of this opportunity to alter his meridians. Without such fortuitous encounters, it would be hard for the rest of his direct disciples to succeed as well. Hearing those words, the crowd could not help but lower their heads in disappointment. It's indeed impossible for ordinary humans to absorb this energy. The 100 schools of philosophers have tried many times, but not even the most talented geniuses were able to adapt to it. Kong Shiyao added with a bitter smile. There was no one on the master-teacher continent who knew more about the mercury-like spiritual energy than the 100 schools of philosophers. For many generations, they had guarded this seal, and within this period of time, they had already fully familiarized themselves with the nature of the mercury-like spiritual energy. With so many talented individuals failing in the past, it did not seem likely that they would all be able to overcome this limitation anytime soon. Even though you might not have succeeded thus far, with time, your body should gradually get used to the mercury-like spiritual energy, Zhang Xian said. Based on the records from tens of thousands of years ago, the population then couldn't even survive 3 seconds in the face of the heavy spiritual energy before their meridians ruptured completely. However, the current population, including those who have yet to cultivate, can last for at least 10 minutes in the face of the mercury-like spiritual energy, as long as they don't absorb it into their body. Kong Shiyao nodded in agreement. Those words brought a frown to Zhang Xian's face. Why would that be? Allow me to take a look. By right, the situation for ordinary humans should not change by too much. Even if the green sprout wheat altered the constitution of ordinary humans, a fighter 8 Dan cultivator should still be as powerless in the face of the mercury-like spiritual energy as a fighter 1 Dan cultivator. But there was actually such a huge difference over time. Could it be that the green sprout wheat had altered something else? Zhang Xian swiftly spread his spiritual perception across the entire great frontispiece of Confucianism, and he swiftly located some of the ordinary citizens. The green sprout wheat has not only enhanced their constitution, it seems like their meridian network has also developed in a much different manner compared to the cultivators of the master-teacher continent. Zhang Xian was shocked. He did know that the green sprout wheat had strengthened the bodies of those living in the Kungsa domain, granting them the strength of Zhongshe realm at maturity, but he had never thought of checking their meridians. Over many years of development, the meridian network of the local population was starting to show some similarities to that of the otherworldly demonic tribe. This explained the significant increase in the duration that they were able to withstand the mercury-like energy. Perhaps this is the path that mankind is destined to walk on in order to advance further. Zhang Xian sighed deeply. Initially, Zhang Xian had intended to find a different way for Zheng Yang and the others to adapt to the mercury-like spiritual energy, but the sight that he had just seen changed his mind altogether. It felt like the only way to truly adapt to the mercury-like spiritual energy was through altering one's meridians. And if Zheng Yang and the others were to go around it the normal way, it would be impossible for them to succeed in their lifetime. However, in order for them to alter their meridians, they would have to first destroy their meridian networks. But the aeon of ancient sage that they would require to make a full recovery was so massive that it was not an amount that he could procure. Furthermore, what if they were unable to reform their meridians after shattering them? Zhang Xian pondered deeply for a moment before asking, "Shiriao, where are ancient sage Yinqing and the others?" The battle with the deity had reduced ancient sage Yinqing and the others to mere skeletal racks. With all of them on the verge reaching the limits of their lifespan, it would simply be a waste of resources for them to recover anymore. Nevertheless, before Zhang Xian left on his self-discovery journey, he saw Kong Shiyao sealing them in ice to preserve their conditions. Half a year had passed since then, but it should be likely that they were still alive. Kong Shiyao also nodded in response. "They are currently in hibernation. Bring me to them. I just might have a way to save them," Zhang Xian instructed as he gathered a bundle of the mercury-like spiritual energy in his hands. Those words made Kong Shiyao widen her eyes in excitement. Knowing the conditions that ancient sage Yinqing and the others were in, all she could really do was to delay the inevitable. She thought that it was really the end of these great men, who had devoted their lives to protecting the 100 schools of philosophers. But Zhang Xian's words sparked a glimmer of hope in her eyes. She immediately led the way forward, and they soon arrived in a sealed room. In the room, the bodies of ancient sage Yinqing and several other ancient sages were placed side by side along a round elevated platform. Beneath the platform were various artifacts that constantly supplied the ancient sages with the vitality required to sustain their lives as long as possible. Such a method couldn't increase their lifespan, but at the very least, it was able to delay their deaths as much as possible. This was also the method they had used in order to last the past 10,000 years. Zhang Xian walked right up to ancient sage Yinqing's skeletal rack, and with a snap of his finger, he released the seal cast around him. The skeletal rack slowly roused to consciousness. "Zhang Shi." The skeletal rack swiftly rose up and bowed deeply. "I have found a way that could potentially save you. However, as I have never tested it before, I can't guarantee its success. If it works out, your lifespan will be extended, and you will enjoy a huge leap in your cultivation. However, if it fails, you'll lose your life right away. Are you interested in taking this gamble?" Knowing that the other party's time was limited, Zhang Xian got straight to the point. "I want to give it a try." Ancient sage Yinqing replied decisively. Since he was doomed anyway, there was no reason for him to clutch onto this straw of hope, even if the chances were slim. "Good. I have a Junqi circulation method over here that I need you to practice right now. Furthermore, while you are reforming your physical body, I want you to create your meridians according to this map I have over here." Zhang Xian tapped his finger and imparted the reverse method of the simplified Heaven's Path divine art and the meridian network mapping he had drawn a while ago into ancient sage Yinqing's head. It took ancient sage Yinqing 10 minutes to fully comprehend the meridian network and the Junqi circulation method. He wasn't too sure what Zhang Xian was exactly up to, but he was confident that the latter wouldn't harm him. Thus, he took in a deep breath before driving his Junqi in accordance to the Junqi circulation method. TZ. With a snap of his fingers, Zhang Xian released the mercury-like energy he had gathered previously, causing it to swiftly suffuse the surroundings. The presence of this energy caused ancient sage Yinqing to tense up in anxiety. Nevertheless, he gritted his teeth and resolved himself to push it through. He began absorbing the surrounding mercury-like energy using the Junqi circulation method Zhang Xian had provided, expecting to feel a crushing pressure anytime soon. But as some time passed, an uncomprehending look appeared on his face instead. When he absorbed the mercury-like spiritual energy, based on the Junqi circulation method provided by Zhang Xian, he felt that the mercury-like spiritual energy was nourishing his body instead of crushing it. Delighted, he continued absorbing the energy excitedly, and within 4 hours his physical body was already fully restored. Due to the changes in his meridian network, his body was emanating an overpowering killing intent, making him seem like an otherworldly demon from afar. Seeing that the first phase of his plan had worked, Zhang Xian's eyes glowed in delight. He quickly issued the next set of instructions. Good. Now try to push for a breakthrough to Dimension Shatter a Realm. Ancient sage Yanqing nodded as he continued absorbing the mercury-like spiritual energy, as his accumulation over the past 10,000 years was far greater than Zhaoye. It took him only 2 hours to reach Ancient Sage 4 Dan. As a result of his breakthrough, his lifespan increased as well. With this, he was no longer at risk of dying at any moment anymore. Thank you, Zhangshi. Words could hardly describe Ancient Sage Yanqing's feelings, as he felt the torrent of energy coursing through his body. He quickly kneeled onto the floor to express his gratitude to Zhang Xian. He was already prepared to face death after his overexertion while trying to repair the formation. But who could have thought that the other party would bring him back using such an unusual method? Not only so, he even achieved a breakthrough in his cultivation and reached a level that he thought he would never reach. The mercury-like spiritual energy sure is incredible. Not only does it hasten one's rate of cultivation, it also recovers one's body at a rate faster than the Aeon of Ancient Sage. Seeing that his guess was on the mark, Zhang Xian heaved a sigh of relief. Under normal circumstances, given the limited amount of vitality that Ancient Sage Yanqing had left inside his body, he wouldn't have been able to fully recover his physical body, even in an environment rich in the Aeon of Ancient Sage. However, it was a completely different matter if he were to absorb the mercury-like spiritual energy instead. This type of condensed spiritual energy harnessed an incredible amount of power within it. As long as one was able to absorb it, it could heal any severe wounds swiftly. After confirming the feasibility of the method, Zhang Xian unhesitatingly brought the remaining ancient sages to the elevated platform before waking them up. He warned them of the risks involved first before imparting them with the same Jinqi circulation method and meridian network mapping he had given to ancient sage Yanqing. All of them decided immediately to go along with Zhang Xian's plan, especially after seeing the method had worked on ancient sage Yanqing. Eventually, most of them managed to take the final step and successfully reached Dimension Shatter a Realm. But there were accidents as well. 2 ancient sages made a mistake in their cultivation and ended up having their skeletal racks crushed by the heavy spiritual energy, causing them to die on the spot. Nevertheless, all of this showed that this was a feasible course of action to take. Thus, Zhang Xian called his direct disciples over and asked, "Are you willing to go through any danger in order to reach Dimension Shatter a Realm?" The 8 of them nodded their heads in agreement. Without any hesitation, Zhang Xian waved his hand, and all 8 of them immediately spurted blood simultaneously. That single strike had shattered all of the meridians in their bodies. Cultivate in accordance with this, and be warned that you mustn't make even the slightest mistake. Don't blame me for not warning you if you were to die in the end. Zhang Xian said as he imparted them with the 2 manuals as well. Zheng Yang and the others had watched ancient sage Yanqing's rebirth with their own eyes, so they were well aware as to what they should do. Furthermore, as they had cultivated the simplified version of the Heaven's Path divine art, they were extremely familiar with it. While they had never tried cultivating it in reverse before, it didn't take them long to get used to it. In the end, Kong Shiyao was the first one to fully recover and reach Dimension Shatter a Realm. Trailing behind her were Zheng Yang, Wei Ruyan, Lu Chong and Wang Ying. And 5 days later, even the weakest of them, Zhang Jiuxiao, had reached Dimension Shatter a Realm too. With this, all 9 of Zhang Xian's direct disciples had become ancient sage for Dan Dimension Shatter a Realm experts. Teacher. Seeing that they had succeeded, all 9 of them cheered in delight. Their teacher had actually accomplished a feat that even Kong Shi failed to back then. Seeing that his final job here was done, Zhang Xian quickly gathered all of them together and revealed his intent to them. "I'm intending to open up the seal and enter the azure. The circumstances up there are still unknown for the time being, and it's likely that untold dangers lurk beyond. Thus, I want all of you to stay put here for the time being and guard the master-teacher continent in my stead. Wait for my news, all right? Over the past 5 days which his direct disciples had spent cultivating to dimension shatter a realm, he had been pondering over his next move, and he found that his convictions still remained the same. He wanted to head to the Azure and find Luo Ruoxin. He did think of whether he should bring his students along, but he eventually decided against it, especially given the dangers he involved. Teacher, we wish to come along with you. Zhaoye stepped forward and declared, no matter what kind of danger lies in the path ahead, we'll follow wherever you go. There is nothing that can make us stand down. Zheng Yang nodded in agreement. While the others didn't say a word, the look of resolution on their faces clearly indicated their stance as well. It was due to their teacher that they were able to achieve their current accomplishments. If their teacher was going to undergo untold dangers, there was no way they would be able to remain here with a peace of mind. I appreciate your sentiments, but we can't just leave the master-teacher continent as it is at the moment. With the massive rebalancing in the power distribution of the master-teacher continent, there's no saying what would happen in the future if all of you were to disappear at once. Rest assured, once I have confirmed the situation in the Azure, I'll try to inform you all through Lu Yang's rituals. Zhang Xian explained with a smile. The Azure was bound to be filled with innumerable top-notch experts, and even if he was no match for them, he was at least confident of escaping from them if he were alone. However, if he had to bring all of his students with him, he was not confident that he would be able to ensure their safety. Besides, unlike him, his students had their own responsibilities on the master-teacher continent, and they couldn't afford to simply leave on a whim. Take Lu Yang, for example. He was the highest leader of the otherworldly demonic tribe. It hadn't been long since the situation over at the otherworldly demonic tribe had been stabilized, and if he were to disappear at this juncture, there was no saying that others would exploit this opportunity to launch a coup d'état against his rule. If so, mankind could potentially be in danger once more. Then, teacher, you must take care of yourself. Knowing that their teacher had already made up his mind, and no one would be able to sway his decision, the 9 of them lowered their heads in disappointment. Zheng Yang, I have tempered the Dragonbone Divine Spear with the heavy spiritual energy, and it has already achieved a breakthrough to dimension shatter a realm. I shall now bestow it upon you. I don't know whether other deities would try to descend to the master-teacher continent after my departure, so I'll be counting on you to protect mankind from such external threats. Zhang Xian said as he passed the Dragonbone Divine Spear over. Due to the dimension barrier, it was impossible for him to bring any items, including his storage rings, along with him up to the Azure. Furthermore, given his current level of cultivation, the Dragonbone Divine Spear was indeed not of much use to him anymore. Wang Ying, you specialize in spirit enchantment, but spirit enchantment takes time. I'll bestow the Golden Origin Cauldron to you. It'll safeguard your safety. Zhang Xian said as he brought out the Golden Origin Cauldron from the myriad anthive nest. Over the past 5 days, while this brick-like fellow hadn't managed to achieve a breakthrough to dimension shatter a realm from the nourishment of the mercury-like spiritual energy, it was already very close to doing so. Since he was unable to bring the other party with him, it would be best for him to entrust it to his students. He took out the treasures he had on him one after another, and distributed them equally to his students before heaving a sigh of relief. With the current cultivation realm of his students, and the treasures they had in their possession, even if a group of deities descended at this moment, they would be able to deal with them calmly, without fluster. As for Vicious, he was sealed within the Book of Heaven's Path, which could be deposited into the Library of Heaven's Path. Considering this fellow was a figure who was able to stand on equal grounds with Kong Shi back then, it might spell a calamity in the future if he were to leave this fellow on the master-teacher continent. Despite all they had gone through together, he found that he was still unable to fully trust Vicious, so he felt that it would be best to keep the latter close with him. As for the Dongshu gourd, it was hiding in his dantian, so there shouldn't be any trouble bringing it across the dimension barrier. As for his clone, he found that while the other party was unable to enter the Library of Heaven's Path, The other party was still able to enter the Great Codex of Spring and Autumn. Given that the Great Codex of Spring and Autumn formed an independent space separate from the Library of Heaven's Path, and that the clone shared the same soul with Zhang Xian, it didn't come as a surprise that his clone was able to enter the space too. With this, he should be able to bring his clone with him too. With everything in place, Zhang Xian looked at the formation above of him, and with a wave of his hand, he opened up a rift in it. After which, with a powerful leap, he dashed right toward the rift. Previously, the downpour of mercury-like spiritual energy would cause a huge burden to both his physical body and his soul. But with his cultivation reaching Dimension Shatter Realm, he no longer felt any discomfort from it anymore. On the contrary, he felt like a traveler stumbling upon an oasis in the desert. It was invigorating. Kacha. Beyond the formation, he saw innumerable black patches of void. The shattered space between the two dimensions formed powerful spatial turbulence that tugged at him from all directions. It's fortunate that I have reached Dimension Shatter Realm, or else the spatial turbulence would have torn me to shreds. Zhang Xian thought grimly as he trudged his way through the spatial turbulence with difficulty. This spatial turbulence was truly far more powerful than whatever he had experienced in the past. Putting aside blood reincarnation realm cultivators, even ordinary Dimension Shatter Realm cultivators could succumb to the spatial turbulence and end up being torn to shreds in a moment of carelessness. If not for his incredible accumulation and superior strength, even he would have difficulty trying to get past this. Nevertheless, the spatial turbulence still inflicted many glaring lacerations on his body, causing blood to flow endlessly from his body. There was no road in this passageway, and the entire passageway consisted of nothing but collapsed space. It was only through the Library of Heaven's Path that he could discern a safe passageway, or else he could have easily lost his way in this desolate space. Hung long. Just like that, he traveled for nearly half a month. Gauging by the distance he had traveled so far, he figured that he should be reaching his destination very soon. But at this moment, a massive bolt of lightning suddenly appeared before him, sealing his pathway forward. Just as Zhang Xian was wondering how he could overcome this obstacle, another flash of lightning bolted down and struck Zhang Xian before he could react, causing him to black out. With a splitting headache, Zhang Xian gradually regained consciousness. The first thing that came into his line of sight was a white ceiling. Swiftly scanning his surroundings, he found that he was lying on a bed in a relatively spacious room. My strength. Slowly sitting up, Zhang Xian winced from the excruciating pain with every inch he moved. He took a look at his own body and found that it was wrapped tightly in bandages. He tried to drive his own jinqi, but he realized that the jinqi that remained in his body had become pathetically low. Why is my jinqi so heavy? Taking a closer look, he noticed that his jinqi had become incredibly heavy. Even slightly driving it created a huge strain on him. It swiftly dawned on him that it was not that he was low on jinqi, but that the vast amount of jinqi that he had previously stored in his body had been condensed into mercury-like jinqi. It was true that such a heavily condensed jinqi would grant him greater burst power, but the problem was that he could not even drive it, let alone use it to recover from his injuries. He quickly tried to recall what had happened prior to this. I entered the passageway leading to the Azure, but I ended up getting blocked by a bolt of lightning. I was going to find a way to circumvent it when I was struck by another bolt of lightning and ended up blacking out. Seeing the mess that his body was in and recalling his memories prior to the accident, Zhang Xian narrowed his eyes in astonishment. Could it be that I am already in the Azure? Since he had blacked out in the passageway, he had thought that he would wake up drifting aimlessly in there. But before he knew it, he was already lying in a room with his body fully bandaged. Could it be that he had somehow managed to bypass the lightning region and successfully arrived at the Azure? This notion prompted Zhang Xian to swiftly scan his surroundings. Thus, he attempted to release his spiritual perception into the surroundings, only to end up with his mouth twitching uncontrollably. In the past, his spiritual perception could easily over millions of li, but at that moment, it was firmly stuck within his body, refusing to come out at all no matter how he pushed. What incredible spatial pressure this is. At this point, it was already certain that he was in the azure. Not only was he unable to deploy his spiritual perception, but even his flight ability had been restricted. In fact, even his usual movements had been curbed significantly due to the immense spatial pressure. Gugugugug. Suddenly, a rumbling sound echoed from Zhang Xian's abdomen. He was hungry. Ever since he had cultivated to transcendent mortal, he had been able to sustain his bodily needs through absorbing spiritual energy and cultivating. It did not matter whether he ate or not. This was the first time in a long time that he had felt so starved. It felt almost as if his body was completely empty. Sighing deeply, he closed his eyes, and through his senses, he could feel that the surroundings were filled with an abundance of mercury-like spiritual energy. In terms of concentration, it was at least 10 times higher than what had descended back at the elevated platform of the Kungsi domain. He tried absorbing the mercury-like spiritual energy there to refine it into his own jinqi to recover his injuries. But the next moment, his face reddened, and a mouthful of fresh blood spurted from his lips. There was a series of violent coughing, and Zhang Xian had to strike his chest several times before the stifling sensation finally lessened. Back when he was uninjured, he could still use the sheer resilience of his body to endure the backlash caused by the absorption of the mercury-like spiritual energy. However, with his current tattered body and cracked meridians, just trying to absorb the mercury-like spiritual energy made him feel like his body was going to collapse, let alone trying to assimilate it. It looks like I can only give it a try after my injuries recover a little. Zhang Xian sighed deeply. He knew that impatience would get him nowhere, so he decided to simply let things run their course. Nevertheless, the fact that he was unable to drive his jinqi at all, and the sheer extent of the damage that his body had suffered meant that he was almost no different from an ordinary human. He would have to tread carefully until he finally recovered his strength. First and foremost, I should start by finding myself some food, Zhang Xian muttered as another series of hunger pangs struck him. Struggling to his feet, he rubbed his stomach as he trudged out of the room. Ho-ho-ho! Pushing the door open, he heard a series of sharp wind currents slicing in the air. Turning his gaze over, he saw a young man holding a steel sword in hand executing a sword art. While his movements were not fanciful, they carried a peculiar grace to them that made them extremely pleasing to the eye. One thing that quickly caught Zhang Xian's eye was that the young man's left leg was as stiff as a block of wood. Zhang Xian could not tell whether he had suffered an injury or that was the original state of his body, but it was clearly impeding his movements. His foundations are still okay, but his sword art is severely lacking. Zhang Xian frowned. Grab any 3-star master teacher from the master teacher continent, and the sword art that the other party executed would be even more profound than the young man before him. However, considering the difficulties in the young man's movements, it could barely be considered acceptable. Zhang Xian heaved a slight sigh, and it immediately caught the young man's attention. He halted his sword practice and turned his head over. Upon seeing Zhang Xian, a look of delight crept onto his face as he said, "You're awake." Taking a closer look at the young man, the other party seemed to be in his late teens. He was not too tall, roughly a head shorter than Zhang Xian. Using the measurement system from his previous world, the young man would not even be at 1.6 meters. There was a glaring scarlet birthmark roughly half a cheek wide imprinted on his left cheek, and it concealed part of his face. In terms of appearances, the young man could not be associated with the word handsome at all. In fact, he might be considered hideous even. "Thank you for saving my life." Zhang Xian clasped his fist. "It's nothing much. I saw you by accident, so I brought you back. I thought that you would die given the severity of your wounds, but you somehow managed to recover on your own." The young man scratched his head awkwardly as he spoke. His words were a little awkward, hinting that he was not too good with social interaction. Third young master. At this moment, an elder walked into the courtyard. Upon seeing Zhang Xian, he was stunned for a moment before calmly bowing to greet him. "Sir, it seems like you are finally awake." Zhang Xian returned the gesture with a simple nod. He assessed the elder before him closely and noticed that the latter's clothes were stained with oil marks. The corners of his lips were a little torn, and there was a hint of fresh blood. His cheeks were also bruised. It was apparent that he had just been beaten up by someone else. The crippled young man known as Third Young Master turned his gaze over as well, and as soon as he saw the current state of the elder, his face warped in astonishment. He hurriedly rushed over and worriedly asked, "Elder E, what happened?" "Third Young Master, it's nothing," Elder E replied awkwardly. However, the young man continued staring at Elder E intently, clearly unconvinced by the latter's words. Eventually, under the persistent stare of the young man, Elder E relented and said, "The second young mistress of the City Lord Manor is here. Shueqin is here." This news caused the eyes of the crippled young man to glow in excitement. "That's right." Seeing the response of the young man, Elder Yi's face grew even redder. It was as if there was something that he wanted to say to the young man, but he had no idea how he should broach the subject. The crippled young man also swiftly noticed that there was something amiss about Elder Yi's expression. The smile faded from his face as he asked, "Does her arrival have anything to do with your injuries? Isn't the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion coming to our town to accept menial disciples 3 days from now?" Elder E was conflicted for a moment before continuing. Through tapping into the connections of the City Lord Manor, second young mistress Shueqin managed to acquire a slot in advance. She managed to obtain a slot in advance? The crippled young man's face lit up in joy. Isn't that good news? But barely after he said those words, the young man lowered his head to look at his crippled left leg, and his face swiftly sunk. "I guess that I don't stand a chance at all. Having acquired the slot, there's no doubt that she will be leaving with those from the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion 3 days from now. Did she come here to bid me farewell?" The crippled young man shook his head and sighed deeply. She. Elder E hesitated for a long while before finally confessing the truth. "She's here to withdraw from the marriage agreement with you." "She wishes to withdraw from the marriage agreement?" The young man's face turned ghastly pale. His body staggered a little, and he nearly fell to the ground. "She's going to withdraw from the marriage agreement with me, just because she has become a menial disciple of the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion?" No matter where one was, being rejected by one's fiancé was something incredibly humiliating. Hearing the conversation between the young man and the elder, Zhang Xian's eyebrows shot up. A talented young lady scorning her fiancé and proposing a withdrawal from the marriage agreement. An injured and insulted young man deciding to buck up and return the favor. 30 years the river's east and 30 years the river's west? To think that he would encounter such a matter as soon as he arrived at the Azure. How exciting life was. This is an idiom used to refer to the cycle of the rise and decline of all powers in the world. It's famously used in the battle through the heavens by the protagonist's back, when he was weaker, to convey that the tables would turn one day. Forget it. After pondering over the matter for a moment, the crippled young man shook his head sorrowfully. "I am indeed unworthy of her. It was only a matter of time before our marriage agreement fell through. As their grandfathers were close with one another, they had heartily decided to betroth the grandchildren to one another. However, with the death of his grandfather, his clan had begun to decline, following which, the young man himself had ended up sustaining severe injuries that had destroyed his inner breath, rendering him unable to cultivate anymore. At the same time, his left leg had ended up crippled, and no matter how many physicians he found, none of them were able to cure it. Facing such a hopeless situation, he had eventually become very pessimistic. Furthermore, he had always suffered from low self-esteem due to his appearance. Considering the difference between the two of them, he did not feel that he was worthy of her. Their difference in standing made the collapse of their marriage agreement an inevitability. Sighing deeply, the young man walked into the room and grabbed a jade box. He entrusted the jade box to the elder. "This is the marriage agreement that sealed our relations together. Give it to her, and tell her that we'll be strangers from this day forth. I hope that she'll be able to find someone better suited to her in the near future," the young man said. "Third young master." Elder Yi's face reddened. He understood the significance of this action, And he was just about to say something when he eventually halted himself and nodded instead. All right then. He's going to chicken out just like that? Zhang Xian blinked blankly. He had thought that the young man would lose his temper, thus triggering some kind of incredible drive that pushed the young man to accomplish something extraordinary. But contrary to his expectations, the young man actually delivered the marriage agreement back just like that. This was no different from the young man putting his face out there for others to stomp on. Even as an onlooker, Zhang Xian could hardly bear to watch. However, he had always maintained a low profile, and it had not been long since he arrived in the Azure. Thus, he eventually decided against speaking recklessly. After obtaining the marriage agreement, Elder Yi turned around and left. In the silent courtyard, the third young master abruptly raised his sword and hacked it down furiously on a nearby boulder, inflicting a deep cut on it. It seemed like he was not completely unaffected by the matter, just that he had chosen to hide his emotions from Elder Yi in order not to worry him. Through the strength that he had exerted, Zhang Xian could tell that the young man was at St. Six Dan. If it was on the master-teacher continent, it would have been an incredible feat for a person to reach St. Six Dan by 16 or 17. However, judging from the earlier conversation, it seemed such a feat was below average in the Azure. Having vented his rage, the crippled young man seemed to finally calm down a little. It was only at this moment that he recalled that the person whom he had saved was standing nearby, and his face blushed in embarrassment. My apologies. I have shown you an embarrassing side of myself. Right, I haven't asked you for your name yet. I am Yao. Pui. I am Zhang Xian. Zhang Xian replied with a nod. So it's Brother Zhang, the crippled young man said. I am Dan Xiaotian, the third young master of Bay City's Dan clan. Brother Dan. Zhang Xian returned the greeting with a nod. I heard you speaking about the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion earlier, Brother Dan. I'm just asking out of curiosity, but is it a sect? The exceedingly obvious question seemed to have surprised Dan Xiaotian as he asked. Brother Zhang, do you not know about the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion? Seeing the confused look on Zhang Xian's face, he widened his eyes in realization and remarked. Ah, I nearly forgot. Brother Zhang, you aren't a cultivator, so it's no wonder you have never heard of the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion. The world that we live in is known as the Forsaken Continent. According to legend, the world that we live in used to be a part of the world of gods, but it was severed from it and cast away. There are 6 major sects in the Forsaken Continent, and the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion is one of them. Entering any of these 6 major sects is viewed as a great honor. Countless desire to join the ranks of the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion. Even if one enters as a menial disciple, the clan behind that disciple will be able to rise through the ranks. Back when he saved Brother Zhang, he could not feel the slightest pulsation of Jinqi within the latter's body. From that, he had deduced that the latter was an ordinary human, not a cultivator. The 6 sects were existences that no cultivator on the Forsaken Continent could overlook. But to ordinary humans, such existences were too far away from them to bother about. Considering that Zhang Xian was not a cultivator, it was not too surprising that he had not heard of the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion. 6 major sects. Is there no Master-Teacher Pavilion here? Zhang Xian asked in confusion. Master-Teacher Pavilion? What's that? Dan Xiaotian shook his head doubtfully. It was just an inside joke. Judging from Dan Xiaotian's tone, it seemed like there was really no Master-Teacher Pavilion on the Forsaken Continent. He pondered for a moment before continuing. So the 6 sects are the de facto leaders of the Forsaken Continent. Exactly. Aside from the 6 sects, there's also a formidable power, known as Ethereal Hall. It suddenly appeared on the Forsaken Continent several thousand years ago, when a powerful expert founded the organization. They managed the distribution of the ethereal token, a resource that all cultivators on the continent require in order to trade for valuable cultivation resources and become true experts. Ethereal Hall? The ethereal token is sold in practically all cities on the Forsaken Continent. By coming into contact with the token, one's consciousness will be brought into the Ethereal Hall. In there, As long as one is able to pay the price, one will be able to learn cultivation techniques, purchase medicinal herbs, raise one's cultivation, or even hire killers. It has pretty much everything that you can think of. Even those of the sixth sex use it. The ethereal token brings one's consciousness into the ethereal hall? Zhang Xian was rather curious about this peculiar artifact. Brother Dan, may I know if you have that artifact here? My cultivation is weak, and my talent is severely lacking too. Even my fiancé has chosen to withdraw from our marriage agreement. How could I possibly be qualified to possess something like that? Dan Xiaotian said with a deep sigh. I apologize. It seems like I was too tactless with my words. Zhang Xian clasped his fist. Following which, he moved on to other topics, and asked a few other questions to gain a deeper understanding of the Forsaken Continent. While Dan Xiaotian was a little awkward in expressing himself, and suffered from low self-esteem, Zhang Xian could tell that the other party was actually very kind. Upon seeing the severely injured him, the other party had actually brought him back and bandaged him. From this, he felt like Dan Xiaotian was a person whom he could trust. Through Dan Xiaotian, Zhang Xian learned that 3 days had passed since Dan Xiaotian had spotted him and brought him back. Strength was highly regarded on the Forsaken Continent. The Dan clan that Dan Xiaotian came from had its era of glory 20 years ago too. It had been viewed as an equal to the city lord residents. Or to be more exact, even the city lord residents had to tread carefully around the Dan clan. Unfortunately, the accident 10 years ago had caused nearly all of the experts of the Dan clan to pass away, and his 2 elder brothers had lost their lives in that incident. Even his foundation had ended up being wounded, resulting in his current state. With the decline of his clan, previous allies swiftly turned against them, and their enemies capitalized on the situation to get back at them. This resulted in the powerhouse swiftly falling to ruins. Currently, other than him and the old servant Dan Yi, there was practically nothing left. What was left of a residence that had once covered over 1,000 mu was just this inner courtyard and an outer courtyard. The Dan clan had truly become a shadow of its former self. If not for the marriage agreement between him and the city lord residents, it was likely that they would not even have had this much left. However, with the second young mistress backing out on the marriage agreement, even the final restraint stopping the enemies of the Dan clan from making a move on him would vanish. Then, everything would really be over. I see. Zhang Xian shook his head. Strength was the foundation of prosperity. Without sufficient strength to protect itself, a power, no matter how prosperous, would eventually fall into decline. Brother Zhang, I think that you should have also gotten a rough idea of my current situation. I was hoping that I could tap into the opportunity in 3 days, when the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion recruits new menial disciples, to possibly allow the Dan clan to make a comeback. But it seems like the situation is completely hopeless now. Furthermore, with Xueqin backing out of the marriage proposal, I'm afraid that this place won't remain safe for too long, Dan Xiaotian said with a bitter smile. As the saying goes, a child from a poor family matures early. The many difficulties that Dan Xiaotian had gone through together with Elder Yi over the years had taught him the callousness of the world. It was truly a miracle that he had preserved his kind soul after all he had been through. Brother Zhang, since you are already able to move, I think you should leave as soon as possible. I wouldn't want you to be implicated in my affairs. As he spoke, Dan Xiaotian took out 2 specially crafted golden coins from his pockets and placed them into Zhang Xian's hands. These are ethereal coins, a currency accepted by the ethereal hall. While this isn't too much, it should cover a few meals. You are too kind. Seeing how Dan Xiaotian was still worried about him despite his difficult plight, a wry smile crept onto Zhang Xian's lips. He looked at Dan Xiaotian intently for a moment before saying, Brother Dan, can you execute your swordsmanship for me once more so that I can have a look? You want me to show you my swordsmanship? Dan Xiaotian was slightly bewildered by Zhang Xian's abrupt request. To be honest, Brother Dan, I examined your swordsmanship earlier, and I realized that your ability to summon your strength and the momentum of your strikes are a little lacking. So, I was wondering if I could take a look. I might be able to find a solution to those problems. If you are able to advance your swordsmanship over the next 3 days, it might be possible for you to be accepted into the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion as its disciple. Zhang Xian said with a smile. With his eye of discernment, he was able to discern the flaws in Dan Xiaotian's swordsmanship and come up with solutions to resolve them. The reason he wanted Dan Xiaotian to display his swordsmanship once more was to test if he could use the Library of Heaven's path there. Brother Zhang, do you understand swordsmanship? Dan Xiaotian asked with a frown. I know a thing or two. Zhang Xian nodded. That's amazing. Well, I have already given up hope on becoming a disciple of the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion, so there's no need for you console me. Dan Xiaotian glanced at his crippled left thigh. Nevertheless, if you are knowledgeable in the field of swordsmanship, Brother Zhang, I would be more than happy to exchange some insights with you. Ever since I have become unable to cultivate, I had to figure my way out bit by bit, so my progress has been rather limited. Dan Xiaotian's low esteem had been exacerbated by his sudden inability to cultivate. As a result, even though he had devoted himself to learning swordsmanship, he did not dare display it before others, let alone find a sparring partner to test his skills on. Perhaps it was because he viewed Zhang Xian as an ordinary human. He did not feel that much lesser than him. Thus, he had no qualms exchanging insights with the latter, who, with a flick of his wrist, Dan Xiaotian's sword sliced through the air and pierced forward. Wang. At the same time, a book materialized in the Library of Heaven's path. After flipping open the book and browsing through its contents, Zhang Xian heaved a sigh of relief. Fortunately, it seemed like the Library of Heaven's path could be used in the Azure. Previously, when Luo Ruoxin placed the Great Codex of Spring and Autumn into the Library of Heaven's path, the latter had gone through a major upgrade. Most likely, it was this upgrade that allowed the Library of Heaven's path to peer into the heavens of the Azure without much trouble. How ludicrous. Dan Xiaotian, you are practicing your swordsmanship? Do you still think that the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion will take someone like you as its disciple? While Zhang Xian was still deep in thought, a cold sneer sounded from the outside, following which, 2 figures walked in with widened strides. The first figure was a young lady who seemed to be around 15 or 16, roughly the same age as Dan Xiaotian. She was dressed in a light yellow dress, and her eyes were filled with pride and smugness. Her chin was slightly tilted up in a condescending manner, reminiscent of a self-important noble standing before a bunch of peasants. She was the one who had spoken earlier. Behind her was a middle-aged man in his 40s. He was dressed in a simple buttoned shirt, and he had a sword tied around his waist. As he approached, one could feel overwhelmingly sharp sword chi emanating from his presence. Third young master. Elder E quickly rushed in behind those 2 figures, and with a look of indignation and guilt on his face, he lowered his head and spoke in desolation. I'm sorry. I couldn't stop them. Dan Xiaotian swiftly halted his swordsmanship before turning to look at the young lady before him. At that moment, he was so agitated that he stumbled on his own words. Zhu Shuaqin. Enough. Looking at Dan Xiaotian with disgust in her eyes, the young lady waved her hands impatiently and said, You know why I have come here. But instead of coming out to welcome me personally, you dispatched a lowly servant to send the marriage agreement over. Did you think that this matter can be resolved that easily? You want to back out of our marriage agreement, so I had Elder E give it to you. What more do you want from me? Dan Xiaotian's face reddened in anger. What I want from you isn't much. I just need you to announce to the entire city that you were the one who chose to back out of the marriage agreement of your own accord, because you feel that you aren't worthy of me. It was after a period of careful deliberation, before my father finally decided to respect your opinion and end the marriage agreement. By giving me this mere sheet of paper, are you expecting me to tell everyone that I, Shuaqin, refused to marry you? How could I allow the noble city lord manor to have such a stain on its reputation? Shuaqin harumphed coldly. If others heard that she had broken off her engagement with Dan Xiaotian because she had successfully become a disciple of the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion, it would surely stir up a huge controversy. This would be detrimental for her in building up her reputation. However, if she could get Dan Xiaotian to back out of the marriage agreement instead, she would not have to sustain the slightest smudge to her reputation. Seeing everything from the sight, Zhang Xian could not help but shake his head in disapproval. She sure is vicious. It was one thing for the Xueqing to back out of the marriage agreement, but to think that she would even want Dan Xiaotian to announce it to the entire city. While backing out of the marriage agreement, she still wanted Dan Xiaotian to become the bad guy. How incredibly cheap she was. With a ghastly pale face, Dan Xiaotian clenched his fists as he glared at Xueqing coldly. It went without saying that Dan Xiaotian had also figured out what Xueqi was up to. Overwhelming indignation seeped in through his entire body. This was utter humiliation. It was as if the other party was preparing to smack his face while asking him to hold up his face for her. But the problem was that there was nothing he could do about the situation. He was completely helpless. Dan Xiaotian, the second young mistress, and I didn't come down here to negotiate with you. We are here to pass down an order to you. The middle-aged man who had come with Xueqing said impassively. Within 3 days, you are to make this announcement to the entire city, or else, be prepared to pay the price. Who are you? Dan Xiaotian asked as he glared at the middle-aged man coldly. I am the swordsmanship teacher of the second young mistress, Xuechen. The middle-aged man replied proudly. Xuechen? I know you. Seemingly having heard this name before, Dan Xiaotian's eyes widened in astonishment before he shook his head in self-mockery. I sure am honored to have the head instructor of the City Lord Manor pay a visit to me personally. May I know what the price I will have to pay if I refuse to abide by your command is? As the head instructor of the City Lord Manor, Xuechen's strength was not to be underestimated. He was in fact an ancient sage 3-dan expert. Well, it's very simple. Xuechen waved his hand nonchalantly, completely unaffected by Dan Xiaotian's provocation. Over these years, the Dan clan has offended quite a few people, isn't that so? You should also know that if not for your engagement with Xueqing, you would have already died many times over. Those words were hurtful, but Dan Xiaotian knew that they were the truth. Given his weak cultivation, if not for the marriage agreement, there was no way the enemies of the Dan clan would have allowed him to live so long. Well, if these men make a move against you, do you think that you and that old man over there will be able to stop them? Xuechen shrugged coolly. Realizing the hidden intention behind Xuechen's words, Dan Xiaotian's eyes widened in disbelief. Are you going to silence us? Aren't you afraid of the possible repercussions my sudden death would have on the City Lord Manor's reputation? How would your death affect the City Lord Manor's reputation? Xuechen remarked calmly. Let me see. Our City Lord would be enraged to learn of your demise, and he would dispatch men to exact vengeance for you. As for our second young mistress, she would mourn for a long time, and eventually, she would decide to depart from this land of grief and head to the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion. Jai. Those words made Dan Xiaotian's heart beat faster and faster as he realized how wretched his situation was. If they really acted out this play, not only would the reputation of the City Lord Manor not be marred, it would even be praised for its compassion. At the same time, Xueqing would also be more respected in the city for her loyalty to her fiancé. They would say that even though Xueqing had become the menial disciple of the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion, she had still held steadfast to her promise to marry him. But alas, as fate would have it, they were not meant to be. Fine. I'll agree to it. Dan Xiaotian's hands were clenched so tightly that his fingernails were digging into his flesh, and his joints had become all white. However, despite his indignation, he knew that the current him was completely powerless. Law of the jungle, survival of the fittest. Weaklings like him were bound to be preyed on by the strong. That is more like it. Xueqing nodded in satisfaction. She raised her hand, and Xuechen immediately took out a document and passed it over to Dan Xiaotian. This is the document for the annulment of our engagement. All you have to do is seal your name on it, and we'll handle the rest. Rest assured, we'll announce the matter to the entire city by today. Dan Xiaotian hesitantly reached out to grab the document before reading through it carefully. It was an official notice supposedly written by him to announce his intention to annul the engagement. And his reason behind the action was stated as well. The reason was extremely simple. He was injured, and not only was he unable to cultivate, he was unable to fulfill the role of a man, making him a true cripple through and through. In order not to stall his fiancée's future, he decided to willfully annul the engagement, and he sought her forgiveness for this. The City Lord Manor, in view of its past relations with the Dan clan, had rejected his proposed annulment of the engagement time and time again, so he had no choice but to officially announce the annulment of their engagement, using such a crude method. He sought the understanding of the City Lord Manor for his abrupt actions. Xueqin was actually going to the extent of claiming that he was crippled as a man. The overwhelming humiliation that Dan Xiaotian felt made his blood surge to his head, and he nearly exploded on the spot. If this notice was released, his dignity would be completely crushed, and he would never be able to raise his head in public ever again. He would become the talk of the entire town, and this shame would effectively destroy the prestige that the Dan clan had built up over several centuries. It would be thorough social suicide. Sign the document, Xueqin said with a cold and pressurizing voice. Third young master, you mustn't sign the document. Once you do, the reputation of our Dan clan will be in shambles. Elder Yi had also read the document from behind Dan Xiaotian, and he immediately kneeled down and cried in protest. Even death was not as fearsome as seeing the clan that he had devoted his life to serving humiliated in such a manner. Dan Xiaotian was at a loss. He knew very well what would happen if he signed the document, but if he did not, the other party would still back out of the marriage agreement, and the outcome would likely be much worse than this. He was already backed to a corner. There was nothing else he could do. At that moment, even suicide had become an option for him. He had never desired so much to end his life, and let all of this come to an end. However, when all seemed lost, a voice suddenly echoed in the air. If you don't wish to sign the document, don't sign it. Everyone immediately turned around, only to see a young man wrapped like a mummy leaning against the doorframe. He was looking at them with a smile on his lips. This young man did not seem to possess any cultivation at all, but his eyes were completely devoid of fear despite standing before an expert of Xueqin's caliber. It was as if everything that was happening before him was nothing more than a small scuffle. Who are you? If this matter doesn't concern you, you will do well to keep your mouth zipped. Haven't you heard of the saying that disaster originates from the mouth? Xueqin glared at Zhang Xian threateningly. If possible, they wanted to resolve the matter with Dan Xiaotian, without resorting to violence, or else there was a risk that word could get out. Thus, Xueqin had no choice but to hold himself back from making a move. With an unfazed smile, Zhang Xian said, I am just an insignificant figure whom Brother Dan has saved. I didn't want to interfere in your business, but I was afraid that Brother Dan would regret his decision if he signed that document, so I couldn't help but advise him so. Brother Zhang. Dan Xiaotian's eyes could not help but light up in gratitude. Even if Zhang Xian did not know of Xueqin and Xueqin's true identity and the tremendous power that they wielded, it should be apparent that those two were figures that could not be trifled with from their conversation. Yet, despite the risk of possibly bringing trouble upon himself, the other party still chose to speak up. Such sentiments left him feeling slightly touched. Regret? Ha ha ha. What kind of regret could he possibly have? Does this brat still think that it's possible for him to get together with the second young mistress? Xueqin scoffed. Snap out of your daydream. Why don't you take a good look at yourself first? A toad like you actually dares to lust for the flesh of a swan? Learn your place. I'm glad to see that there's at least one thing the both of us can agree on. The two of them indeed shouldn't get together. Zhang Xian nodded calmly in response to the other party's insults. It's apparent that this second young mistress of yours isn't worthy of Brother Dan. There couldn't be a worse insult to him than if he married someone like her. What did you say? Xueqin had been nodding gleefully when Zhang Xian spoke the first part of his piece. However, by the time Zhang Xian finished his words, Xueqin's eyes were already dripping with murderous intent. You don't believe me? Zhang Xian looked at Xue Chun with an incredulous expression, as if he was unable to believe that the latter could not understand something so obvious. I guess you really have to see with your own eyes in order to tell the obvious, huh? Very well, come back in 3 days and we'll see the results. After all that was said and done, it seems like you are just trying to stall for time. Futile. Xue Chun sneered coldly. As long as Dan Xiaotian doesn't sign this document, I can assure that what he will lose isn't just his dignity, but his life as well. Zhang Xian shrugged nonchalantly and said, if it's gone, so be it. Someone like Brother Dan wouldn't care about something as trivial as that. Huh. Somehow, Dan Xiaotian felt that there was something very wrong with the words that had just been spoken. It seems like Brother Zhang is a person with extremely strong opinions. But what do you mean by if it's gone, so be it? This isn't a trivial matter at all. My life is on the line here. Turning his gaze away from Zhang Xian, Xue Chun looked at Dan Xiaotian with a look so cold that it seemed like it could freeze hell over. Is that your decision? Dan Xiaotian shuddered a little under Xue Chun's glare, but he gritted his teeth and replied, Brother Zhang's words reflect my intention. He had no idea why Brother Zhang would put so much hope in him, but it was clear that he had no path of retreat anymore. If he had to weigh the dignity of the Dan clan to his own life, he would indubitably choose the dignity of the Dan clan. The Dan clan did not belong to him only. It had been built up with the effort of his predecessors, including his deceased grandfather, father, and brothers. He could not trample on their efforts, just so he could live. Besides, once the marriage agreement was annulled, he would be as good as dead anyway. With this, the decision that he had to make could not be any clearer. You do have some backbone, don't you? Let's see where your decision brings you, shall we? Hearing Dan Xiaotian's final decision, Xue Chun flung his sleeves furiously. He turned to the young lady beside him and said, Second young mistress, let's go. On the other hand, Xue Chun looked at Dan Xiaotian disdainfully and spat. Humph. I hope that you won't come begging for your life when the time comes. Following which, she turned around and walked away. Throughout this entire period, she did not even spare a glance at Zhang Xian, as if it would sully her eyes to look at an ordinary human. As soon as the two of them were out of the courtyard, Teacher. Xue Chun looked at Xue Chun worriedly. Xue Chun quickly scanned his surroundings to confirm that there was no one around before reassuring the young lady. Don't worry. We won't even require 3 days to resolve this problem. The Dan clan is nothing at all. Let's see if they can even survive tonight. Those words made Xue Chun heave a sigh of relief. I had a good impression of him initially, but who could have known that he would turn out to be such an arrogant brat? Let him die then. A person like him doesn't deserve to live in this world. The two of them got into a carriage, and it did not take them long to disappear into the distance. Shortly after Xue Chun and Xue Chun left the residence, there was a brief moment of silence before Elder Yi spoke up worriedly. Third young master, this won't do. We can't just blindly wait here for our deaths. Let's leave the city. He knew that the city lord manor was not as gracious and magnanimous as it seemed on the surface. In fact, he suspected that the massacre and eventual downfall of the Dan clan had been orchestrated by the city lord manor. Since they were willing to go that far, it was likely that they would have no qualms dispatching assassins against Dan Xiaotian, especially after his decisive rejection earlier. Furthermore, with the means of the city lord manor, it was likely that they would be able to erase all traces of their involvement. Since that was the case, the best thing they could do was run as far away as they could. Run away? Do you think that it's still possible for us to run away? Dan Xiaotian shook his head bitterly. The fact that the second young mistress had come personally to reject the marriage showed their determination in ensuring that this matter was resolved without a hiccup. As such, there was no way the city lord manor would allow them to escape. If they could not cancel the marriage agreement, would the second young mistress not have to spend her entire life in loneliness, waiting for him to come back? Brother Zhang. Dan Xiaotian turned to Zhang Xian, hoping to ask the latter for some guidance as to what he should do in this situation, since the other party had made huge promises such as come back in 3 days, and we'll see the results. Perhaps the other party already had an idea in mind. I'd like to confirm your intentions one last time. Were you willing to sign that earlier document? Of course not. Dan Xiaotian shook his head. If I signed that darned paper, how could I face my predecessors even after my death? If he sullied the Dan clan's reputation like that, even his death would not be enough to atone for his sins. Are you afraid of pain? Zhang Xian asked. Even death is no longer that frightening to me. So what does a little pain matter? Dan Xiaotian had no idea what Zhang Xian was getting at, but he still answered the question honestly. Do you wish to exact vengeance for the humiliation you have suffered today? Of course. It isn't just today's humiliation. If I could, I would exact vengeance for all of the insults I have suffered ever since my parents' death. But Dan Xiaotian looked at his own leg with a crestfallen look. How could he possibly feel nothing when being insulted in such a manner? But with his leg in such state, and his inability to cultivate, such intentions would only remain intentions in his head. They would never come to fruition. If he had still been that talented youth, he would not have to live his life so subserviently. Good. Since you have made up your mind, the last thing you have to do now is acknowledge me as your teacher. Zhang Xian said. Acknowledge you as my teacher? Did Brother Zhang's head bump on something that resulted in a concussion? What am I supposed to learn from an ordinary human? Could it be that your promise of come back in 3 days referred to this? Dan Xiaotian's lips twitched as he suddenly felt as if he had been bamboozled. Dan Xiaotian wasn't the only one who was bewildered by Zhang Xian's proposal. Even Elder Yi was taken aback. With twitching lips, Elder Yi said, Master Zhang, this is a very serious matter here. Pardon me, but I'll have to ask you not to mess around. Their lives were at stake, but the other party was still in the mood to make jokes. If he had known that this fellow was so unreliable, he never would have allowed the third young master to save him and bring him back. Looking at the expressions on their faces, Zhang Xian could tell that they doubted his abilities. Thus, he placed his hands behind his back with the intention of displaying the disposition of a true expert. But his movements only ended up tugging on his wounds, causing his lips to twitch hideously as a result. He had to wheeze a little before he managed to suppress the pain and proceed with his expert disguise. You injured your meridians back when you were younger, causing your body to be unable to drive Jinshi. At the same time, your dantian was also damaged, so you are unable to store any energy. As a result, you are unable to cultivate at all. Is my analysis right? Dan Xiaotian nodded in response. He had been 6 when that incident happened to the Dan clan, shattering his dantian and meridians. He had been unable to recover his dantian and meridians since then. So even though he spent every single passing day practicing his swordsmanship, he was unable to infuse Jinshi into his swordsmanship. In other words, his moves carried only the form, but not the true essence behind them. He had consulted many physicians regarding his condition, but none of them had been able to cure him. In the end, he had given up and resigned himself to it. Then, do you know what the cause of the injury to your dantian and meridians is? Zhang Xian asked. Some kind of powerful Jinshi has slipped into my body, inflicting devastating damage all around. It's already a blessing that I'm still alive now, Dan Xiaotian replied. This was the diagnosis given to him by most of the physicians that he had met. Jinshi, Zhang Xian shook his head. If it was the result of another cultivator's Jinshi lingering in your body, considering how diligently you cultivate each day in hopes of improving your own condition, do you think that it's possible for you not to show the slightest improvement after so many years? That question left Dan Xiaotian stumped. That was also what had left him bewildered too. For 10 years, he had met all kinds of famous physicians, and he had tried many different types of treatment, be it medicinal essence, pills, acupuncture, medicinal baths. None of them had worked. His body was like a tattered gunny sack. Any spiritual energy that he absorbed would eventually dissipate, making him unable to advance his cultivation. Many famed physicians had told him that it was the result of hostile Jinshi lingering within his body, undoing all of his efforts. They had assured him that their treatment would work, but none of them had been effective. With time, Those physicians had eventually deemed him to be incurable and given up on him. Dan Xiaotian pondered for a moment before asking Zhang Xian, if it's not the result of hostile lingering jinqi in my body, what else could possibly be destroying my meridians and dantian, and yet not cause my death? What was truly bizarre about his condition was that, aside from his inability to cultivate, it did not affect any other aspect of his life. Xueqin claimed that he was unable to carry out the responsibilities of a husband, but that could not have been more incorrect. He knew better than anyone that he would wake up with a majestic pillar that rose high into the heavens every morning. It's a goo, Zhang Xian stated. Someone has planted a goo in you, which has resulted in all sorts of treatments being ineffective on you. Goo. Dan Xiaotian was stunned. Are you saying that there's a worm living in my body? It isn't just living. It has been absorbing all of the energy you have cultivated over the years, so it has already become extremely powerful. Zhang Xian added, through the Library of Heaven's Path, he was able to locate the core of Dan Xiaotian's problem in an instant. The reason his dantian and his meridians had been refusing to recover over the years despite his efforts was because someone had planted a goo in him. This goo would relentlessly devour all of the energy that he cultivated, and this was the source of his cultivation failing to inch forward at all over the past 10 years. A living worm actually exists inside of me. Dan Xiaotian turned to look at Elder Yi with a deep frown, and the latter contemplated deeply for a brief moment before shaking his head. What they had just heard was simply so unbelievable that they could hardly swallow it. If there was really a goo in his body, and it had been in his body for the past 10 years, how could the many physicians that they had consulted previously possibly be oblivious to it? And how could the young man tell? I can sense some reservations from you too, and I can understand why. However, I do have a way to prove the matter though. Zhang Xian could tell from the expressions of those two that they did not believe what he was saying, but it was not a problem to him. Do you have a silver needle or the like here? Elder Yi nodded. He walked into the room, and it did not take long for him to return with a box of silver needles. Here you go. As the saying goes, those who are constantly plagued by afflictions eventually become doctors themselves. They had tried out all sorts of remedies over the past 10 years, such that most fundamental medicinal equipment could be found in their residence. Have a good look. I'll catch it out right now. With a light chuckle, Zhang Xian grabbed the silver needles and flicked them forward. Ding-ling! All of the needles fell onto the floor 3 meters away from him. Cough cough. I don't really have too much strength right now, so I need you to come closer to me, Zhang Xian said awkwardly. He was so used to flicking needles from a distance that he had forgotten that he was still unable to use his jinqi, which severely limited what he could do. All right. While Dan Xiaotian felt that Zhang Xian was not really a reliable person, after a moment of hesitation, he still made his way over. Since the situation was already like that, he might as well go along with it. There was nothing to be lost. Taking out a couple of silver needles once more, Zhang Xian took a deep breath as he invoked the Library of Heaven's Path once more. After which, he pierced the silver needles according to the positions stated in Dan Xiaotian's book. Ding! Another unexpected hiccup happened that caused Zhang Xian's face to redden. In his current weak state, he was actually unable to pierce the silver needle through Dan Xiaotian's skin. While Dan Xiaotian was unable to cultivate anymore, his cultivation was still at St. 6 Dan. Furthermore, his constitution had been nourished by the mercury-like spiritual energy over the years, making his physical body even tougher than steel. While Zhang Xian was able to move his body around, he was still feeble from the damage that he had sustained. He could not even gather enough strength from his body to pierce through Dan Xiaotian's skin. Help me with this. Zhang Xian looked at Elder Yi and beckoned him over. Elder Yi quickly walked over. With a tap of his finger, a surge of jinqi flowed through the silver needle, and the silver needle straightened once more. So, the tip went right into Dan Xiaotian's body. Peng! Zhang Xian was just about to control the silver needle, when the silver needle suddenly flew out at an even faster speed, piercing right into the wall. Dan Xiaotian and Elder Yi widened their eyes incredulously, especially the former. As the person receiving the acupuncture, He knew that he did not exert any force, but the silver needles still flew out at such a swift speed. Could it be that there was really some other being existing in his body? You should have felt it. It was the goo in your body that pushed it out, Zhang Xian explained. To be honest, he did not have the means to kill the goo in his current state. Nevertheless, by bringing Dan Xiaoyan's attention to the existence of the goo, he should be able to win the young man's trust. With sufficient time, he was confident that he would be able to resolve this problem once he recovered his strength. There really is a goo in my body. Dan Xiaoyan could not speak another word. A moment ago, he had been confident that there was no way such a vile thing would be in his body, but what he had just witnessed had caused his confidence to waver. Putting aside the fact that he had not exerted any force, even if he did not have the ability to jolt the needle right into the wall. While the earlier needle did not harm the goo at all, it showed that we are aware of its current location. So, it's likely that the goo will move to another location before settling down. While it's moving, you will be able to drive your jinqi, and your crippled left leg will recover for a brief period of time, Zhang Xian said. However, this recovery is temporary. Once it settles down, everything will go back to as it was. The only way you can resolve this situation once and for all is to kill it. Is that so? Dan Xiaoyan was still a little dazed by the happenings. A few moments passed, and his eyes suddenly widened in disbelief. Just as Zhang Xian had said earlier, he could feel jinqi flowing through his body once more. Not only so, feeling had returned to his numb left leg as well. He tried taking a few steps, and his movements were no different from those of an ordinary person. There was not the slightest difficulty. However, the feeling in his left leg only remained for 10 breaths, before turning as numb as a block of wood. Knowing that there was nothing wrong with his diagnosis, Zhang Xian said with a light chuckle, "You should be able to trust me now, right?" Disciple Dan Xiaoyan pays respect to teacher. Knowing that this was an invaluable opportunity for him to break out of his current state, he immediately got onto the ground and bowed down. Many renowned physicians had taken a look at his condition, but none of the treatments that they provided had made a difference to his condition at all. However, with just a glance from afar, Zhang Xian was already able to identify the root of his problem and even demonstrate it to him. From this alone, it could be seen that the other party was a person of great capabilities, no matter how he might seem on the exterior. Rise! After Dan Xiaoyan carried out a formal greeting to acknowledge Zhang Xian as his teacher, Zhang Xian quickly walked forward to help him up. To be honest, he had initially planned to steer clear from the affairs of the Azure as much as possible, focusing his efforts on finding Luo Ruoxin. However, Dan Xiaoyan had saved him, so he wanted to return the favor. Having acknowledged Zhang Xian as his teacher, Dan Xiaoyan looked at the young man before him expectantly and asked, "Teacher, may I know how I can get rid of the goo in my body?" Just the thought of there being a worm crawling in his flesh and leeching off his body was more than enough to raise goosebumps on his arms. He had not been too affected by it in the past, because he had not been aware of it, but at this rate, he would not even be able to sleep well at night as long as the goo remained. "I am able to remove the goo in your body, but I am too weak at the moment. I'll have to recover from my injuries before I can do anything about it," Zhang Xian replied. If not for his severe wounds, just a blast of his heaven's path jinqi would decimate whatever goo was crawling in Dan Xiaoyan's body in a breath. However, in his current state, he could not even exert his jinqi. As such, while he was able to identify where the goo was, he could not do a thing about it. More importantly, the goo even gleefully pushed his silver needle out, as if taunting his weakness. This was really testing the limits of his patience. "Recover from your injuries?" Dan Xiaoyan echoed when he suddenly widened his eyes in realization. "Ah, I nearly forgot. I have a couple of valuable recovery medicine here, and I was planning to feed you some of them, so that you could recover from your injuries. However, you've been in a coma for the past 3 days, and I didn't dare use them recklessly. Since you're already awake, allow me to bring those pills to you right now. Once the medicinal energy diffuses throughout your body, it shouldn't take too long for you to recover to your full strength." Most high-tier recovery medicine were incredibly potent, such that it required one to facilitate the assimilation of the medicinal energy using one's jinqi. If one recklessly fed it to an unconscious patient, there was a good chance that the powerful medicinal energy would end up harming the patient. As such, they had put off the matter till now. A few moments later, Eldery walked into the room with a jade bottle in hand. He uncorked the jade bottle, and the fragrant scent of herbs immediately drifted across the room. It was a grade 8 recovery pill. Zhang Xian took out a pill and swallowed it without any hesitation. However, a moment later, he sighed deeply and said, "I'm afraid that the medicine you have isn't of much use to me." Despite Zhang Xian's current seemingly powerless state, his core was still a Dimension Shatterer realm cultivator. While grade 8 recovery pills could be considered invaluable panacea for curing all sorts of wounds for a Saint 6 Dan cultivator, it did not even cause the slightest ripple in Zhang Xian's body. "It isn't of much use to you?" Dan Xiaotian quickly instructed Elder E to bring over the best recovery medicine that they had, but none of it turned out to be of use to Zhang Xian. "Are there any large markets in this town where I can buy recovery pills or medicinal herbs?" Zhang Xian asked with a deep frown. "There is a market, but the medicinal herbs and pills sold aren't too advanced. The pills that we have here are already the best on the market." Dan Xiaotian scratched his head. Considering how those pills were completely useless to the young man before him, it would be meaningless to buy more of them. "Is there any way to acquire higher-tier pills?" Zhang Xian asked. As long as he did not recover from his injuries, he would be unable to cure Dan Xiaotian. At this rate, they were simply too vulnerable. Putting aside surviving the third day, it was questionable whether they would be able to get through the night. Dan Xiaotian pondered for a moment before replying. Most cultivators purchase high-tier pills through the ethereal token. As long as the trade is successful, the items will be swiftly delivered. Ethereal token? Hearing that familiar name, Zhang Xian nodded. Then, is there any way I can acquire an ethereal token? This was the second time that he had heard of this artifact after entering the Azure. It seemed like the top echelon of the Azure revolved around this single artifact. Regardless of whether it was to acquire top-notch cultivation techniques or high-tier pills, one required an ethereal token. From the looks of it, they would not be able to get anywhere without an ethereal token. All Zhang Xian needed was a sufficiently high-tier pill to temporarily stabilize his wounds, so that he could absorb the mercury-like spiritual energy from the surroundings and convert it into heaven's path jinqi. Once that happened, all of the problems would swiftly be resolved. He would be able to remove the goo from Dan Xiaotian's body and teach him swordsmanship, thus saving the young man from his current plight. The city we live in is simply too small, so there's no ethereal hall here. As such, there are no vendors selling the ethereal token. Dan Xiaotian frowned. Is there no other way to acquire it? Zhang Xian asked. There is one way a person can get an ethereal token in our city, Dan Xiaotian said. But it's simply so difficult that it's no exaggeration to say that it's completely impossible. Back when the Hongyan market was first established, in order to draw more customers into its premises, the owner inscribed 10 difficult questions and created a list of prizes corresponding to each of the questions. As long as one is able to solve a question, one will be able to acquire the corresponding prize. It successfully drew huge crowds to the Hongyan market, and 9 of the questions have been solved thus far. The prize of the final question remaining is an ethereal token, and there are many people who are dying to lay their hands on it. However, due to the sheer difficulty of the question, it remains undeciphered to date. Bring me there, Zhang Xian said. Even if there was a vendor selling ethereal token there, it was not as if he had the money required to purchase it. Of course, with his means, he should be able to make money quickly, but that would be a great deal of trouble. Thus, it would be best if he could acquire the ethereal token like that. Knowing that there was no other way around this matter, Dan Xiaotian nodded in agreement. As Zhang Xian's injuries were simply too severe, and even walking put huge strain on his body, they could only travel to the Hongyan market in a carriage. It took roughly 2 hours for them to finally arrive before a massive marketplace. Dan Xiaotian leaped out of the carriage before carefully supporting Zhang Xian. Together, they headed to the wall where the 10 questions were inscribed. As a popular tourist attraction site, there was a huge crowd swarming in the vicinity. The possibility of being able to obtain an ethereal token for free was too great a temptation, so it was understandable that people wanted to give it a try. Sai, it's wrong again. You have been here 10 times over the past 2 months, but you still haven't succeeded. Why do you just keep coming back to embarrass yourself time and time again? What's wrong with that? It's not as if I'm embarrassing you. Besides, you came here many more times than me. If it's that easy to solve this question, it wouldn't have remained undeciphered even after all these years. The crowd gradually thinned as challengers failed one after another. The system that verified the accuracy of the answer was rather similar to the wall of dilemma that he had encountered in the past. Basically, every answer provided would be evaluated on the spot to determine whether it was right or not. This was also why it attracted a huge crowd every day. Perhaps, one might just stumble upon the correct answer by luck. On the way here, Zhang Xian had learned from his conversation with Dan Xiaotian exactly how valuable the ethereal token was. Every single token was so precious that even ancient sage experts would have difficulty forking out the money for one. Judging from Dan Xiaotian's depiction, it seemed like even if he could bring out everything in his storage ring and sell his possessions there, he still might not be able to afford one. At the same time, he gained a deeper understanding of the Azure, as those living in the Azure had lived their life amid the Mercury-like spiritual energy. Their constitutions were exceptionally resilient, surpassing even the otherworldly demons of the Master-Teacher continent. Just like his previous self, most of them possessed the strength of a Saint 1 Dan at birth, and that would increase all the way to Saint 9 Dan when they finally matured as an adult. Someone like Dan Xiaotian, who was only at Saint 6 Dan despite already being on verge of adulthood, was deemed a weakling with no future ahead of him. For example, despite being of similar age to one another, his fiancée, Xue Qin, was already at Great Sage 3 Dan consummation, making her one of the strongest experts in the city. The city they were in, Xinjiang City, was not an extremely large city, such that ancient sages were the most powerful existences there. One thing of note was that it was under the jurisdiction of the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion, which explained why it was recruiting disciples in the region. The lord of Xinjiang City was Xue Qin's father, Xue Yao, and he was known to be the #1 expert within the city. That being said, his cultivation was only on the same level as Zhang Xian, Dimension Shatter Realm primary stage. So, once Zhang Xian recovered his strength, there would be no one else in the city who would be able to pose a threat to him anymore. As such, he had decided to make this his first priority. Zhang Xian placed all of those thoughts to the back of his mind and raised his head to take a closer look at the wall not too far away. Let me see what kind of question has put so many at a loss, such that it remains unsolved even after so many years. Even if a nurturing yang pill is forged to the level of perfection, the yang energy that it harnesses is still so violent that it can't be controlled by the cultivator consuming it. It did not take Zhang Xian too long to finish looking through the question. The question was not too complex. Basically, it was prompting others to solve one of the key problems surrounding the nurturing yang pill via proposing feasible modifications to its forging process. The nurturing yang pill was one of the necessary cultivation resources for cultivators practicing yang cultivation techniques. It would fill them up with the vigor and drive required to further their cultivation. The pill formula was the work of an ingenious apothecary, capitalizing on the synergistic properties of many medicinal herbs in order to amplify the eventual medicinal energy deposited within the nurturing yang pill. However, the pill had a fatal flaw. After consuming the nurturing yang pill, due to the massive buildup of yang energy, cultivators would have to seek an avenue to vent their heat. Once they vented their heat, it would result in a huge loss of yang energy, which was extremely wasteful of the resource. This was a problem that many apothecaries had sought to resolve, but it still remained an issue. Improving an already ingenious pill formula was simply no easy feat. It was for this reason that no one had succeeded even after so many years. Nurturing Yang pill? After reading the question, Zhang Xian tilted his head slightly in confusion. The master teacher continent had all kinds of pills, and he boasted an understanding of countless of them, due to the incredible number of books he had read. Yet, he had never heard of the nurturing Yang pill before. Fortunately, perhaps in consideration that the general public would not have too much of an understanding of this pill, the other party had left behind a detailed pill formula and its forging process. Zhang Xian took those into the Library of Heaven's Path, compiling a book out of them. I see. Zhang Xian nodded. There were many differences between the medicinal herbs of the master teacher continent and the Azure, so the pill formulas and forging processes varied greatly from one another. Luckily, the Library of Heaven's Path was still working perfectly. With a glance, all of the flaws and errors in the combination of medicinal herbs and the forging processes became apparent to him. Dan Xiaotian also noticed the smile on Zhang Xian's lips, and he could not help but ask out of curiosity, "Teacher, do you know of the solution to resolving this problem?" He had also looked into this matter for quite a while, but it was to no avail. Could his teacher really have an answer to the problem with just a single glance? "I do have an idea in mind." Zhang Xian confirmed Dan Xiaotian's thoughts. Dan Xiaotian widened his eyes in shock, and he hurriedly asked, "Then, how should the problem be resolved? If we are just looking at this single issue, the solution isn't actually that complicated. In the pill formula of the nurturing Yang pill, there's a medicinal herb known as inferno grass stem. The problem can be resolved by switching that medicinal herb with the spirit matriarch grass." Zhang Xian explained with a lowered voice. "Spirit matriarch grass, isn't that a yin attribute medicinal herb? Will we really be able to forge the nurturing Yang pill if we add something like that?" Dan Xiaotian was a little surprised by the answer. Due to his crippled condition, he had studied quite a lot regarding pills and medicine. The inferno grass stem was not the most potent medicinal herb in the pill formula, but it played an indispensable role in forming the ultimate product. He did not think that a pill could be formed if one swapped it for the spirit matriarch grass. On the contrary, the spirit matriarch grass would neutralize the yang energy, thus causing all of the medicinal energy to be cancelled out. Yin and yang exist as complements to one another. While the spirit matriarch grass is a yin attribute medicinal herb, it is able to serve as a medium to nourish and calm the medicinal properties of the key ingredient, crimson fire flower leaf. This will solve the problem without causing any depletion in the medicinal energy of the pill, Zhang Xian explained. The complementary properties of yin and yang were common knowledge on the master teacher continent, and it was a concept often used in pill formulas. Yet, to think that no one in Xinjiang City knew of this. From the looks of it, it seemed like despite the stronger average prowess of those in the Azure, in terms of the development of occupations, it was nowhere close to the master teacher continent. On the master teacher continent, Kongshi's ideals had been propagated for tens of thousands of years, encouraging the open sharing of knowledge and furthering of mankind's wisdom. In comparison, it was obvious that the Azure was severely lacking in comparison. This, Dan Xiaotian was perplexed. He was just about to ask about the matter when he heard some chatters behind him, following which, he saw the crowd around the wall opening up a pathway for a group of people. Who are they? They seem to be quite lofty. A middle-aged man amid the crowd asked in displeasure. "Shh, don't speak nonsense." A knowledgeable soul hurriedly hushed that middle-aged man up. "Those are the experts from the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion, who are here to recruit menial disciples. Do you see that man in the middle? It's said that he has a deep understanding of pill forging. They are the experts from the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion?" The face of the middle-aged man, who had spoken earlier, paled in fright. He hurriedly backed off to the sides to allow the approaching group to pass through. The Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion commanded great prestige in Xinjiang City, and no one would dare challenge their authority there. At the same time, Zhang Xian turned to take a closer look. The person standing at the forefront of the group was a cold-faced young man, probably in his mid-20s. He was dressed in a gray robe, and there was a sword tied to his waist. His eyes flickered with a hint of rational coolness, giving the impression of a person who would never let his feelings get in the way of his decisiveness. Despite his young age, the young man's cultivation was impressive, reaching ancient sage for Dan Dimension Shatter a Realm. There was no such expert on the master-teacher continent, but it felt like it was not too rare to see cultivators of such a level here at all. The Azure sure was a frightening place. While Zhang Xian was assessing the young man, he could not help but notice that Dan Xiaoyan's body had tensed up along with the arrival of the group. Glancing over, he saw that the latter's fists were tightly clenched. Tracing the latter's line of sight, he saw Xueqin, the young lady who had dropped by the Dan clan earlier to coerce Dan Xiaotian into backing out of the marriage agreement, walking right behind the gray-robed young man. She wore a tight purple dress that shaped out her proud figure beautifully, and its low neckline revealed her fair-colored neck. Her head was tilted upward slightly, and she emanated an aura of pride and loftiness. The fact that she was allowed to follow the experts of the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion around was more than enough to show that she had already been confirmed as a disciple of the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion, and for a small place like Xinjiang City, it could indeed be considered an impressive feat. Such a problem actually stumped you all for so long, the gray-robed young man remarked as he swiftly read through the problem on the wall. He gestured to the young man behind him and said, "Write down the answer for me. Change the Inferno grass stem to Spirit Matriarch grass." "All right." The young man hurriedly walked over to the wall to write down the answer, not expecting the other party to see through the crux of the problem with a glance as well. Even coming up with the same answer as his teacher, Dan Xiaotian widened his eyes in astonishment. He turned to his teacher and exclaimed, "But we were the ones who found the answer first." He had been doubting the accuracy of his teacher's answer when those from the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion came over and gave the same answer. That meant that there was really no mistake with his teacher's answer. However, if it was the group from the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion who gave the answer instead, it meant that the ethereal token would go to them instead. Just as Dan Xiaotian was about to rush over, he felt someone grasp his wrist tightly. It was his teacher. "Don't bother, it's too late now." Dan Xiaotian turned his head over and saw that the young man from the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion had already written down the answer on the wall before pressing his palm down on it lightly. Wang! A brilliant red light flashed from the surface of the wall. "It's the correct answer?" As expected of an expert from the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion, he was actually able to solve the problem with just a swift glance. "I have long heard that the experts of the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion were figures who stood at the peak of this world, and it seems like that's truly the case. Their reputation is not unfounded at all. The number of disciples accepted by the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion each time around is extremely limited. I wonder how many people from the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion will be able to meet the mark this time around. It might just be a mere menial disciple, but it symbolizes the opportunity to rise to become an outer disciple, then an inner disciple, and finally a direct disciple. My bet is that there will be just 3 people. It has always been like that." A huge commotion broke out amid the crowd. Even a question that had stumped the whole of Xinjiang City for more than a decade was solved so easily by the group from the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion. Those from the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion were truly extraordinary beings. "Young master, I would like to congratulate you on solving the final problem of the Hongyan market. This is the reward that we have prepared for you." Very soon, a slightly plump middle-aged man walked over with a fawning smile on his face. He was holding onto an opened wooden chest carefully with both of his hands, and sitting in the middle of the chest was a palm-sized token. The token was densely inscribed, and one could feel slight pulsations of spiritual energy coming from it. "Is that the ethereal token? I heard that even a single one of those costs 100,000 ethereal coins. Wow. I don't think I can't ever afford that in my entire life." They might all be cultivators who had grown up in the Azure, but the ethereal token was a commodity that only the upper echelons of the continent possessed. There were only a few of them in Xinjiang City, so most of them had never seen one before. The gray-robed man grabbed the ethereal token in between his two fingers and drove his junqi through it. After confirming that it was the real deal, he nodded in satisfaction before sliding it into Xueqin's hands. I'll give it to you. Xueqin's eyes widened in delight as she received the ethereal token, and even her breathing hastened from agitation. It was not just the value of this gift that excited her. What was more important was the significance behind the gift. It was already a huge blessing for her to be able to become a menial disciple of the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion, but to receive a gift directly from the young man before her. With this, she would become the envy of the entire town. Holding on to the ethereal token tightly, Xueqin bowed down and said, "Thank you, senior." After giving her thanks, she suddenly noticed Dan Xiaotian amid the crowd, and a sharp glint flashed through her eyes. She immediately made her way over to the latter, and with a mocking smile on her lips, she said in a hushed voice, "You're here as well? Were you trying to obtain this ethereal token to turn your situation around? What a pity though, it's already mine. You really should learn your place. Do you think that a person like you is worthy of possessing an ethereal token? Naive." Previously, she had been afraid that the rejection of the marriage proposal would affect her reputation. But with a senior from the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion taking such care of her, she had nothing to fear anymore. What did Dan Xiaotian even count as? They were already in two different worlds. So what did she have to fear about him? Of course, there was also the fact that the area was filled with men from the City Lord Manor, so no one would dare leak the news out. Not even the wandering cultivators who had dropped by to try their luck would dare speak a word of the matter, as long as they valued their lives. Besides, she was not speaking too loudly, so it would be hard to discern what she was saying. "You." Dan Xiaotian's body stiffened at being humiliated once more. "Who is he?" the gray-robed young man suddenly asked. "He's just a friend I have met in the past." Xueqin scoffed at Dan Xiaotian one last time before turning around to face the gray-robed young man, replacing her scorn with a sweet smile in the blink of an eye. "Let's go," the gray-robed young man said before walking away. Xueqin quickly rushed forward to keep up with him. Dan Xiaotian trembled quietly with a lowered head for a moment, before he turned to Zhang Xian, with an apologetic look on his face. "I'm sorry, teacher." His teacher had already revealed the correct answer, but he had actually doubted his teacher. If not for his teacher spending some time to explain the matter to him, the ethereal token would already have been theirs. To receive such a valuable gift from her senior, it seems like that fiancé of yours didn't acquire her position as a menial disciple of the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion through proper avenues. Zhang Xian remarked deeply, before turning to look at Dan Xiaotian with a smile on his lips. "Do you wish to return the favor?" "Return the favor?" Dan Xiaotian was taken aback. Xueqin already had the experts of the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion on her side, so how could they possibly exact vengeance on her? Watch closely. Without explaining himself, Zhang Xian walked forward and shouted, "That friend from the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion over there. May I ask you to stop for a short moment?" The gray-robed young man continued walking away without any hesitation, as if not having heard Zhang Xian's voice at all. The edges of Zhang Xian's lips crept up as he continued, "Friend, the answer you provided is inaccurate. I don't think that it's very fair for you to leave with the ethereal token, just like that." His voice was extremely loud, suppressing the surrounding voices in an instant. Everyone turned to look at him with stupefied looks on their faces. The other party was an expert of the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion, and to actually claim that he was wrong so publicly. "Are you tired of living?" The gray-robed young man halted in his tracks, and turned around to look at Zhang Xian with a deep frown etched on his forehead. With an awful look on her face, Xueqin coldly spat, "Dan Xiaotian, if you don't want to die, you'd better keep your subordinate's mouth in check." She recognized the mummy standing before her as none other than the person who had spoken up against them earlier at the Dan clan. It was out of magnanimity that she did not pursue his insolence. But who could have known that he would dare to continue spout nonsense? He isn't my subordinate. He's my teacher." In a moment of anxiety, Dan Xiaotian began stuttering once again. Teacher? No matter what, the Dan clan was still once a formidable existence. When did you fall so far such that even weaklings like him are worthy of being your teacher? Xueqin remarked disdainfully. I don't think it's any business of yours who Dan Xiaotian acknowledges as his teacher. Unless you are still dreaming of becoming his fiancé, Zhang Xian replied calmly. You. Xueqin's body stiffened upon hearing those words. Seeing Xueqin's response, a cold glint flashed through the eyes of the gray-robed young man. He gazed down at the mummy before him coldly and said, You mentioned that my answer isn't correct? Indeed, Zhang Xian replied. To show you that I'm not making things up, I am even willing to make a bet with you. The one who loses will be subjected to the other party's command. You are courageous to speak to me in such a manner, the gray-robed man remarked as he assessed Zhang Xian nonchalantly. Tell me, what is your basis for determining that my answer is wrong? There's no need for that. There's a much easier way to resolve this problem than with our mouths. All we need to do is find an apothecary to forge the nurturing yang pill, based on the answer you have provided, and feed that pill to someone. You will understand once you see it, Zhang Xian said. You want to test the practicality of the solution I have provided? The gray-robed young man frowned. The first response that came to his mind was to reject Zhang Xian's request, because he felt that it was too troublesome. But when his gaze swept across the crowd, he noticed doubtful looks on their faces. So, after a brief moment of silence, he raised his hand and said, Bring an apothecary over. The young man following behind him quickly left the group, and not long later, he returned with the plump middle-aged man, who had brought the ethereal token over earlier, as well as 2 apothecaries. The plump middle-aged man snapped his fingers, and a large army of attendants immediately rushed forward to set up a table of medicinal herbs and 2 cauldrons. I need the 2 of you to forge the nurturing yang pill according to the formula over there. The plump middle-aged man instructed the 2 apothecaries. Nodding, the 2 apothecaries swiftly began forging the nurturing yang pill. They followed the instructions written on the wall precisely, adding medicinal herbs one after another with impeccable timing. When it was finally time to add in the inferno grass stem, they threw the spirit matriarch grass in instead. As soon as the spirit matriarch grass was thrown in, the 2 cauldrons immediately began rattling non-stop. One of the apothecaries could not contain the billowing energies within the cauldron, and eventually, the entire cauldron exploded deafeningly on the spot. It was fortunate that protective measures had been taken beforehand, so no one was hurt as a result of the accident. Nevertheless, the explosion still intimidated many people amid the crowd. They hurriedly backed a distance away, as they continued watching the pill forging process worriedly. The remaining apothecary was clearly more skilled, as he controlled the responses of the medicinal herbs adeptly. An hour later, a set of freshly baked nurturing yang pills was finally delivered out of the cauldron. Its surface glistened beautifully with a natural shine. It seemed that their luck was not too bad. Not only were the pills formed, they had even reached the level of perfection. Good. After seeing the pills, the gray-robed young man nodded in approval. He quickly scanned the crowd before beckoning a young man over. The cultivation technique you practice seems to be yang attribute in nature. I need you to help me test the medicinal properties of the pill. Perhaps due to his trust in the ascendant cloud sword pavilion, the young man swallowed the pill without any hesitation. The pill swiftly melted in his mouth, and a tremendous amount of yang energy swiftly flowed into his meridians. It took only an instant for the young man's face to turn scarlet. The young man hurriedly sat down to drive his jinqi, hoping to keep the influx of yang energy under control for his own assimilation. But the more he tried to control the yang energy, the greater the backlash he faced. Eventually, white smoke began rising from the top of his head. It did not take too long for his eyes to start reddening, as the heat started getting the better of him. I can't stand it any longer. Unable to take it any longer, the young man rushed up to one of the aunties watching the spectacle, and reached out to rip her clothes. Slah! The ripped clothes scattered all over the ground. Without any hesitation, the young man began to force himself on the auntie to carry out some indescribable act, but there was an abrupt sharp pain at the back of his neck before he collapsed onto the ground. The gray-robed young man of the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion had stepped in at the vital moment to prevent a tragedy from occurring. The fact that the young man had only gone berserk after eating the nurturing yang pill showed that his pill formula was insufficient in resolving its problems. Not only so, the side effects seemed to have worsened. The young man who had consumed the pill could not control his impulses at all. The pill formula that I have come up with does have some problems. With an awful look on his face, the gray-robed young man turned his head over to Zhang Xian and asked, "However, how did you know about it? Do you by any chance know the correct answer?" To be honest, he had heard of this problem prior to coming to Xinjiang City, and he had conducted quite a bit of research before coming up with the correct answer. He definitely did not manage to solve the problem as easily as he had made it appear. The main reason he wanted to put up such an act was to bulk up the reputation of the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion in Xinjiang City. Just that. Who could have known that instead of bulking up the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion's reputation, he would end up being humiliated instead? As displeased as he was, he knew that it would be unwise for him to lose his temper. He would only embarrass himself further if he displayed a lack of graciousness. "I do have an answer," Zhang Xian replied with a smile. He whispered into Dan Xiaoyan's ear, and the latter looked at him with a bizarre expression. After confirming that Zhang Xian was not joking with him, he walked up to the wall and penned down an answer with a brush before handing it forward. Just like before, a red light flashed from the wall. The gray-robed young man frowned as he impatiently remarked, "The person checking the answer is right here, so why don't you just read it out loud?" What was the point of beating about the bush when the manager of the Hongyan market was already standing among them? The young man could just read out the answer, and they would be able to discern whether it was right or not together. Dan Xiaotian looked at his teacher, and after receiving a confirmatory nod, he began reading out the answer that he had written out earlier with an awkward look on his face. "Change the inferno grass stem to spirit matriarch grass." The crowd was silent for a moment before a huge commotion broke out. "Huh? Was I hearing things? Isn't the answer the same as the one that the young man from the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion came up with?" The gray-robed young man also narrowed his eyes as a menacing aura flowed out from him. "Are you trying to mock me?" The other party had confidently pointed out that he was wrong, but he had ended up giving the same answer. Just what the hell was the other party up to? Dan Xiaotian himself was feeling a little giddy as well. He had completely no idea what his teacher was up to. "Don't you know that trying to make fun of an expert like this is a huge taboo? You'll lose your life. You are thinking too much," Zhang Xian replied calmly before shooting an exasperated glance at Dan Xiaotian. "What are you doing? There is still a label at the end, right? Read it out." "Ah, right." Dan Xiaotian nodded as he hurriedly continued. "After the solution, there's a bracket that states not local." "Not local? Wait a moment, what does that mean?" Everyone was bewildered by the additional label. Even the gray-robed young man was unable to make sense of what was happening. What did not local refer to? Was there some kind of difference between the local spirit matriarch grass and those not from the region? The nurturing yang pill serves to reinforce the yang energy of a cultivator. In order to stabilize the effects of the pill, swapping the inferno grass stem with the spirit matriarch grass is indeed the ideal solution. In fact, the solution you have proposed would have surely worked out if the pill forging was conducted anywhere else, Zhang Xian said as he slowly walked up to the cauldron and touched the medicinal sludge from the exploded cauldron earlier. However, the solution simply doesn't work here. Xinjiang City has its back facing the Xian River, and that's where its name originates from. This river originates from the sea, and what flows through it isn't fresh water but salt water. The crowd nodded in agreement. While Xinjiang City was not located near the sea, it was connected to it through the Xian River. However, it was a pity that what flowed through the Xian River was salt water, making it unsuitable for drinking or commercial activities. As such, despite its decent location, it had still failed to develop into a major city. Among the territories of the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion, it could only be considered a third-rate city. Its economy was not doing too well at all. As a result, the farmlands in the area were irrigated with salt water, and the plants growing in the region carry some salt content. At this point, I would like to invite everyone to take a closer look at this medicinal sludge. Do you notice anything peculiar about it? Zhang Xian asked as he showed his hands to the others. The crowd leaned in to take a closer look. Amid the black mess on his finger, there was a layer of white powder. It was faint, but as saint cultivators, they were able to easily tell what it was. The gray-robed young man also walked up to the medicinal sludge to take a closer look before touching it slightly. White powder stained the tip of his finger. He brought it to his lips and licked it, and there was a slightly salty taste. It's salt, the gray-robed young man nodded, following which, Zhang Xian continued his explanation. The spirit matriarch grass lives in marshlands, thriving in dark, damp locations. Its leaves should have carried a slight acidity, but this is neutralized by the salt content of the other medicinal herbs, and that ruins the yin attribute of the spirit matriarch grass. As such, it is unable to serve as a medium to calm medicinal energies contained in the other medicinal herbs, resulting in the yang energy becoming even more violent after losing the inferno grass stem. That's also why the young man completely lost control of his rationality earlier, after consuming the nurturing yang pill. He was completely overwhelmed by heat. There's actually such a factor? Fervent discussions could be heard all around. Had pill forging always been such a delicate process, such that even a slight change in the environment would make a huge difference? The gray-robed young man was slightly taken aback. Was this really why his pill formula had failed? He swiftly examined the remaining medicinal herbs that had not been used for the pill forging. With a tap of his finger, he ignited one of the medicinal herbs, and upon closer examination, he noticed some salt amid the ashes too. Pill forging is a very delicate process. The difference in a single medicinal herb or a single process could easily result in failure. Countless medicinal herbs could be ruined just because of a slight difference. Naturally, an apothecary has to take note of the geographical location, the local climate, the state of the cauldron, one's state of mind, and the techniques utilized in the forging process. All of this has to be considered before one embarks on the pill forging. A mistake is a mistake. I know that someone from the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion won't deny that, right? Zhang Xian asked with a gentle smile. My misjudgment has indeed resulted in a failed pill forging. I'll admit that much. Knowing that he would only hurt his reputation if he argued his way out of this, the gray-robed young man harumphed coldly. I'll give the ethereal token to you then. Without any hesitation, he took the ethereal token from Xueqin's hands and tossed it over to Zhang Xian. Xueqin's face twitched as she felt a burning sensation on her face. It was just a moment ago that she had obtained this invaluable treasure, but in less than 2 hours, it was already another man's possession. I shall humbly accept the gift, Zhang Xian replied as he slipped the ethereal token into his pocket. Then, his eyebrows suddenly shot up as a realization seemed to have struck him. Oh right, I nearly forgot. I mentioned earlier that I wanted to have a bet with you, and that the one who lost the bet would have to listen to the winner's command. You didn't agree to the bet explicitly, but neither did you reject it. Since that's the case, should I take it that the bet is still effective? Seeing that Zhang Xian was pushing the boundaries, the eyes of the gray-robed young man narrowed threateningly. He had never thought that a person from this remote city would actually be able to corner him to such an extent. On the other hand, Zhang Xian seemed to be completely oblivious to the gray-robed young man's rage, as he pointed to Shui Yin nonchalantly and said, Well, my command isn't anything much. I just want you to give Xueqin over here 3 crisp slaps in my stead. What? Xueqin's face warped in horror upon hearing those words. You're tuning in to the Li Mei's Wuxia Whispers YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.